It was a sunny afternoon on a quiet college campus, the kind of day when life seemed ordinary and safe. Students laughed, walked between classes, and went about their routines, completely unaware that a predator was moving among them. Ted Bundy, the charming, polite young man with an unassuming smile and an uncanny ability to appear trustworthy, had already identified his next victim. No one could have imagined the darkness lurking behind that calm exterior. In an instant, life would be shattered, normalcy replaced with terror, innocence replaced with fear. Bundy's crimes weren't just about violence. They were about manipulation, control, and the terrifying ease with which he could turn trust into a weapon. This is the story of America's most cunning serial killer, a man who hid evil behind a smile, evaded justice with daring escapes, and left a trail of horror that haunted the nation for a decade. Brace yourself as we step into the chilling mind of Ted Bundy, where charm masks murder and every friendly face could conceal unimaginable danger. By the end of this video, you might just be drifting off to sleep. So take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more true crime stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Now let's begin. Chapter 1: A Perfect Mask. The early life of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy's story does not begin with the dark shadows of crime scenes or the grim headlines of newspapers. It begins quietly, almost innocently, in a world where no one could have imagined the storm he would one day unleash. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, his early life was shrouded in confusion and hidden truths. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried, a stigma in the conservative social climate of the 1940s. To protect her reputation and her son's future, Ted was told for years that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. This single deception would become one of many layers of falsehood and secrecy that would define Bundy's character. Those who later studied Bundy's life often pointed to this early deception as the first crack in his sense of self. Imagine growing up believing one thing about your identity and then discovering it is not true. For a child like Ted, it planted the seeds of alienation and mistrust. Yet on the surface, he seemed like any other boy, polite, shy, and curious. He excelled in school, enjoyed outdoor activities, and had a knack for charming adults. This contradiction, the appearance of normalcy hiding inner turmoil, would later become his hallmark. In 1950, Louise Cowell moved with young Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where she met and later married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook. Ted would take his stepfather's surname, but he never truly accepted Johnny as his father. By all accounts, Johnny Bundy was a kind man who tried to bond with Ted, but the boy remained aloof and distant. He preferred to spend time alone or with his grandfather back east. Even as a child, Ted displayed a keen sense of how to present himself differently depending on who he was with. He could be polite and engaging at school and then cold and withdrawn at home. Friends from Ted's youth often recalled how he seemed awkward with peers but eager to impress authority figures. Teachers described him as bright but socially uneasy. He enjoyed reading, especially adventure stories and detective novels, and he had a fascination with power and control, though no one could have guessed what that fascination would become. These early glimpses suggest a boy who longed for validation but who also nursed private fantasies of dominance and escape. By his teenage years, Bundy was already experimenting with the art of concealment. He learned how to blend in, how to smile at the right times, how to charm adults and classmates. Yet beneath that carefully crafted exterior were troubling behaviors. Some reports suggest he engaged in petty theft as a teen, stealing items from neighbors' garages or sneaking into houses not to take anything valuable, but to experience the thrill of trespassing. This risk-taking hinted at a deeper compulsion, a curiosity about violating boundaries without being caught. Even more unsettling were the stories of how Ted reacted to animals and younger children. While definitive evidence is scarce, a few childhood acquaintances later remembered moments of cruelty or strange behavior. Whether these accounts were exaggerated after his crimes became known or reflected real incidents is hard to verify. But it is clear that by adolescence, Ted Bundy was not simply a shy boy. He was someone already rehearsing how to live two lives, the life people could see and the one he kept hidden. When Bundy entered high school, his social skills improved, and he began to develop the traits that would make him infamous. He became more confident, more articulate, and more aware of his effect on others. He joined clubs, volunteered for activities, and learned how to make a good first impression. Yet even at this stage, there were hints of a dark preoccupation. He later admitted to feeling different from other boys, especially in how he thought about women. While his peers were navigating normal teenage relationships, Bundy was already harboring fantasies of control and dominance. He hid these thoughts carefully, presenting himself as polite and ambitious. By the time Ted reached college, he was, in many ways, the ideal young man. He enrolled at the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington. He studied psychology, a subject that may have appealed to his need to understand and manipulate people. Professors found him intelligent and articulate, while fellow students saw him as quiet but attractive, someone who seemed to be going places. It was during this period that Bundy began dating women seriously, and outwardly his relationships appeared normal. Yet the seeds of resentment and obsession were already sprouting. One of his earliest girlfriends, a young woman from a wealthy family, reportedly broke up with him because she felt he lacked direction. This rejection would later become a key point in Bundy's narrative. Bundy's reaction to that breakup was telling. Rather than simply moving on, he grew determined to win her back, not out of love but out of a need to prove himself. He changed his image, enrolled in law school, and began cultivating the appearance of success. This pattern, using charm and ambition as tools of control, would mirror the way he later approached his victims. To the outside world, Ted Bundy seemed like a young man on the rise, but inside he was already constructing the persona of the perfect man as a mask to hide his growing darkness. By the late 1960s, Bundy was working on political campaigns, volunteering at a crisis hotline, and impressing mentors. Ironically, some of his colleagues at the hotline would later remember him as a calm and compassionate counselor, someone who helped distraught callers with patience and understanding. That detail has always unsettled people. The idea that the same man who would commit horrific crimes once saved lives over the phone. This duality, so stark and so chilling, became part of the enduring fascination with Bundy. As the 1970s approached, Ted Bundy stood at a crossroads. On paper, his life looked promising. Education, political connections, a bright future. But behind closed doors, the darkness was beginning to surface. His fantasies were intensifying, and his ability to separate them from reality was weakening. He had perfected the mask of normalcy, but soon the mask would crack. The charming young man would become the charming killer. As the 1970s dawned, Ted Bundy's life appeared to be a textbook success story. He was handsome, articulate, and politically active, with a bright career ahead of him. But beneath this polished exterior, a darker narrative was taking shape, one that had been quietly developing for years. The young man who had once felt like an outsider was now mastering the art of fitting in, and using that skill not for acceptance, but for concealment. In his early 20s, Bundy began to take deliberate steps to shape how others perceived him. He refined his speech, adopted a more sophisticated style of dress, and learned to project an air of confidence. These changes weren't simply about self-improvement. They were part of a calculated strategy to craft an identity that no one would suspect. At political functions, he could appear charming and earnest, impressing mentors and colleagues alike. On campus, he looked like a serious student, a man with purpose and ambition. In social situations, he cultivated warmth and humor, making him seem approachable and trustworthy. Every interaction became a rehearsal, a way to strengthen the mask he wore. Bundy's political work offered him more than just networking opportunities. It gave him access to power and influence. He volunteered for high-profile campaigns and earned a reputation as a dependable aide. He observed how leaders commanded a room, how they inspired trust, how they manipulated emotions. These lessons weren't lost on him. Years later, investigators would note that Bundy used many of the same techniques to lure his victims: charm, persuasion, and the ability to project vulnerability when it suited him. At the same time, Bundy's private world was growing darker. Friends and acquaintances later said he had a tendency to disappear without explanation, to retreat into his own world. Some noticed a streak of anger when things didn't go his way. He also developed a fascination with crime, particularly violent crime. He read about notorious criminals and followed news stories about unsolved murders. He was drawn to the idea of outsmarting the law, of crossing boundaries and remaining undetected. While many young men might flirt with rebellious thoughts, Bundy's fascination had a different intensity, one that would soon find expression in action. The rejection by his wealthy girlfriend, often referred to as Stephanie in retellings, seemed to sharpen this inner divide. Bundy saw in her not just a lost love, but a symbol of the social world he longed to master. After she ended their relationship, he worked tirelessly to present himself as the kind of man she had wanted: successful, confident, respected. In time, he managed to rekindle their relationship briefly, only to break it off himself as a twisted act of revenge. This episode was a turning point. It demonstrated how Bundy used people not for emotional connection but as instruments to fulfill his own needs for power and control. Meanwhile, Bundy's outward life was increasingly admirable. He attended law school, though his performance was inconsistent. He worked at the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where he wrote a pamphlet on how to avoid sexual assault, a grim irony that would not be lost on investigators later. He also continued volunteering at the suicide hotline, where coworkers, including future true crime author and Rule, found him empathetic and reliable. Rule would later struggle with the realization that the kind young man she knew was the same person responsible for a series of brutal murders. By the early 1970s, Bundy had become a master of compartmentalization. He could attend a political rally in the afternoon, volunteer on a crisis line in the evening, and pursue his darker impulses in secret at night. This ability to live two lives without arousing suspicion would allow him to evade detection far longer than many other killers. It also made his eventual unmasking all the more shocking. How could someone so outwardly normal, so engaged in the community, be capable of such horrors? Those who knew him at this time described him as ambitious but also restless. He seemed to crave not just success but admiration. He liked being noticed, being praised, being seen as exceptional. Yet he also harbored a simmering resentment toward those who had what he felt he was denied: wealth, status, ease. This combination of charm, ambition, resentment, and hidden violence created a volatile mix. The stage was set for the escalation that would soon follow. In later interviews, Bundy tried to explain his crimes as a kind of compulsion, a force outside himself. But his early life tells a more complex story. It shows a man who learned how to deceive, how to manipulate, and how to blend in. It shows someone who could appear gentle while nurturing dark fantasies. It shows, in short, a man who built a mask so convincing that even those closest to him could not see the predator behind it. As the decade progressed, Bundy would step over an invisible line. The fantasies that had been confined to his private thoughts would spill into reality. The charming law student, the promising political aide, the crisis line volunteer, all of these identities were part of a performance. And soon, the performance would give way to something far more dangerous. The story of Ted Bundy's early life is not simply a prelude to his crimes. It is a study in how someone can construct a false self so effectively that even they begin to believe it. It is a reminder that evil often wears a friendly face, speaks in a calm voice, and offers help before it harms. By the time Bundy began his killing spree, he had already perfected the act. He had learned how to be invisible in plain sight. That invisibility, more than anything else, allowed him to become one of the most feared and studied killers in modern history. Chapter 2: A Wolf Among Sheep. Bundy's double persona. By the time Ted Bundy began to make his first moves as a predator, he had already built a public identity so clean and polished that no one looking at him could imagine the darkness behind his smile. This was the essence of his double life, the wolf moving among sheep, appearing harmless even as he studied his prey. In the early 1970s, Bundy stood at the intersection of two worlds. In one, he was a respectable law student, a campaign aide, and a volunteer who spoke softly to suicidal callers on the crisis line. In the other, he was nurturing fantasies of control, violence, and possession that would soon erupt into action. The key to Bundy's deception was his ability to read people. He had a rare intuitive sense of what others wanted to see and hear. With mentors and superiors, he projected competence and reliability. With peers, he played the role of the charming, slightly mysterious friend. With women, he became the attentive listener, the man who seemed safe and trustworthy. This skill allowed him to slip through social circles like water, taking on whatever shape the moment demanded. People would later say that Bundy could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with allies. That power of adaptation was not just a personality trait. It was a weapon he had sharpened for years. And Rule, who worked alongside Bundy at the suicide hotline in Seattle, later described him as one of the most empathetic colleagues she had ever known. She remembered how gently he spoke to desperate callers, how patient he was, how sincerely he seemed to care. In retrospect, the memory unsettled her. How could a man capable of such compassion also commit acts of unimaginable cruelty? The question would haunt not just Rule but the entire country. It went to the heart of Bundy's mystery. His ability to embody two opposing identities so convincingly that each seemed real. Bundy's public persona wasn't merely an act of disguise. It gave him access. His political work and community volunteering put him in contact with a wide range of people. He learned which women were vulnerable, which places were less guarded, which excuses could gain trust. He also learned how institutions worked, the weaknesses in law enforcement coordination, the gaps between jurisdictions, the assumptions people made about what kind of man could be dangerous. Each lesson became another brick in the fortress of invisibility he built around himself. As Bundy's fantasies grew stronger, his public charm grew more polished. He knew instinctively that the more visible and normal he seemed, the safer he was to act out his hidden life. Friends saw him as ambitious but approachable, someone who seemed to have found his direction after an uncertain start. Women described him as polite, even shy, not the kind of man who would ever make them feel unsafe. This carefully maintained reputation would later allow Bundy to walk up to strangers in daylight and lure them away without causing alarm. He understood that his appearance and demeanor were his camouflage. At the same time, Bundy's private thoughts were becoming more organized and more dangerous. He began to plan, not just fantasize. He experimented with ways to approach women, ways to make himself seem vulnerable. A broken arm in a fake cast, a heavy load of books he pretended to struggle with, tricks that played on people's empathy. This was the other side of the double life. Not just hiding who he was, but actively creating a false role to manipulate others. It was theater, but with deadly intent. This period in Bundy's life also revealed another dimension of his double persona. His ability to mimic normal emotions without actually feeling them. Later psychologists would describe him as a classic psychopath, someone capable of charming mimicry, but lacking real empathy. But at the time, no one suspected. In fact, Bundy himself may have been fascinated by how easily he could fool people, as though each successful deception confirmed his superiority. His early successes at blending in reinforced his belief that he was smarter than everyone else, that rules did not apply to him. Friends noticed small oddities but brushed them aside. Sometimes Bundy disappeared for days without explanation. Sometimes he seemed to be two different people, warm and animated one day, cold and distant the next. Yet, in the absence of concrete evidence, these inconsistencies didn't register as warning signs. After all, Bundy was the young man who worked to prevent crime, who answered calls from the desperate at night, who volunteered for civic causes. Everything about his public life signaled trustworthiness. This paradox, the trusted young man secretly nurturing deadly compulsions, is what would later make Bundy's case a watershed moment in American criminal history. Before Bundy, many people imagined serial killers as obvious outsiders, menacing figures who lurked on the fringes of society. Bundy shattered that stereotype. He showed that a killer could look like the boy next door, speak like a gentleman, and move easily through middle-class life. His double persona did not just enable his crimes. It redefined how America thought about danger itself. In those early 1970s years, Bundy was still refining his techniques. He had not yet reached the level of violence and frequency that would later horrify the nation. But the pattern was emerging. A life split into compartments, each carefully sealed off from the others. On one side, the respectable volunteer and law student. On the other, the secret predator planning his first known attacks. The gap between the two identities was widening, and soon the facade would begin to crack. By the middle of the 1970s, Ted Bundy's double life had become a strange kind of routine. By day, he was the respectable student and volunteer, the man who seemed destined for a career in law or politics. By night, and increasingly in hidden moments during the day, he was something else entirely. A hunter rehearsing how to stalk, capture, and control. This ability to slip between two realities was not simply a quirk. It was the core of who Bundy had become. He was no longer just acting out a persona. He was living as two separate selves, each feeding the other. The public-facing Bundy had real accomplishments. He worked as an assistant to the Washington State Republican Party and even developed contacts with key political figures. He knew how to deliver a polished speech, shake hands, and inspire confidence. He used his intelligence to craft reports and proposals that impressed his superiors. Yet even as he excelled in these tasks, he was absorbing something else, a deeper understanding of how systems work and how to exploit them. Political campaigning taught him about persuasion, optics, and timing, all skills he would apply in darker contexts. Bundy's personal relationships during this time also reflected the split in his life. To some women he dated, He appeared devoted and ambitious, the kind of man who might soon be running for office or leading a legal firm. He took them to dinner, remembered small details about their lives, and seemed, at least superficially, to care. But to others, especially those he met casually, he projected a different energy, charming but unpredictable, as if a thin thread of anger or impatience ran beneath the surface. Those who brushed against this darker side often dismissed it as moodiness or stress. After all, wasn't everyone a little complicated? The truth was that Bundy's darker impulses were no longer confined to fantasy. He had begun experimenting with ways to approach women he didn't know, testing what would happen if he used a false injury, a uniform, or an invented story to gain sympathy. He studied people's reactions, learning what worked and what didn't. This wasn't random behavior. It was a deliberate program of practice. Bundy was training himself the way someone might train for a career, except his career was predation. As he grew more confident, the boundaries between his two worlds became dangerously thin. He might spend the afternoon volunteering at the crisis line, offering comfort to a caller contemplating suicide, then spend the evening prowling neighborhoods looking for someone vulnerable. He might attend a political function where people praised his promise, then drive away into the night to act out his compulsions. Each time he succeeded in deceiving those around him, his sense of invincibility deepened. Psychologists who later studied Bundy often remarked on this period as the point where his psychopathy fully crystallized. Psychopathy is not just a lack of empathy. It is also a pattern of calculated manipulation, a belief that other people are objects to be used. Bundy, by the early 1970s, had reached a stage where manipulation was second nature. He no longer had to think about how to charm someone. It flowed automatically. And because his public life gave him constant positive feedback, praise, respect, opportunities, it reinforced his confidence that he could do whatever he wished without consequence. This confidence allowed him to escalate. Where once he might have retreated after a minor act of deception, now he pressed further. He began to drive longer distances at night, scouting locations, watching how women moved in and out of libraries, campuses, and parking lots. He learned the patterns of vulnerability: when someone was distracted, when they were alone, when they would least expect a stranger to approach. These observations were not casual. They were methodical. Bundy was, in effect, conducting field research for his crimes. Yet the mask remained intact. Those who worked with him continued to see a promising young man. And Rule, looking back decades later, would recall how Bundy once walked her to her car after a late shift at the hotline, worried for her safety. She never suspected that the very man expressing concern might be prowling those same streets as a predator. This chilling detail became one of the defining images of Bundy's double persona, the protector and the predator coexisting in the same body. Bundy's own sense of identity may have been fracturing as well. In later interviews, he described feeling driven by forces he could not control, as though he were watching himself from outside. Whether this was genuine self-reflection or just another manipulation is impossible to know. But it's clear that he had reached a point where his false self was no longer just a mask. It was a stage on which his real self acted out hidden scripts. The line between performance and compulsion had blurred. As the decade moved forward, Bundy's dual life would begin to strain under its own weight. The more he acted on his impulses, the more he risked exposure. Yet paradoxically, each successful deception emboldened him, convincing him he was smarter than the police, the press, and even the women he targeted. This arrogance would become his undoing. But in these early years, before the headlines, before the mugshots, before the name Ted Bundy became synonymous with terror, he was still perfecting the art of invisibility. He was still the wolf among sheep, learning exactly how to move without making a sound. Chapter 3: First Shadows. The unnoticed crimes begin. The first shadows of Ted Bundy's criminal life crept in quietly, almost invisibly, like a faint whisper before a storm. By the early 1970s, Bundy had refined his outward persona to a high polish, but beneath that mask the private compulsions that had been building for years were now pressing against the surface. These early incidents, small at first, barely noticed, would mark the transition from fantasy to action. They would also show how skillfully Bundy was able to begin a campaign of terror without drawing attention to himself. Historians and criminologists often debate when Bundy's crimes truly began. Because he was such a practiced liar and manipulator, it's difficult to pinpoint his first attack with certainty. Some believe he began stalking women even in his teenage years, breaking into homes to steal mementos or simply to experience the thrill of intrusion. Others point to unsolved cases from the late 1960s and early 1970s that bear similarities to his later crimes. What is clear is that by 1974, a series of disappearances around Washington state would mark the public's first glimpse of a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. In the months leading up to those disappearances, Bundy was living a life that outwardly appeared steady. He was still enrolled at the University of Washington, still volunteering at the crisis hotline, still maintaining relationships that reinforced his image as a helpful, promising young man. But behind the scenes, he was making forays into darker behavior. He practiced using props, a sling on his arm, crutches, a fake injury, to see how strangers responded. He watched how women left libraries, how they walked to their cars, how they reacted to offers of help. These were rehearsals for crimes that would soon escalate. Bundy's earliest known victims were often young women who fit a particular type. White, college-aged, slender, with long hair parted in the middle. This pattern, which would later be widely publicized, was not random. It reflected both Bundy's personal preferences and his strategic thinking. By focusing on a type, he could hone his methods more efficiently. He learned which approaches worked best with which kinds of women. He learned how to appear non-threatening, even appealing, in exactly the right way for his chosen victims. One of the chilling aspects of Bundy's early attacks was how ordinary they looked from the outside. A woman would be approached in a public place by a polite, attractive man who seemed to need help. Perhaps he had dropped some books or was struggling with a heavy load. Perhaps his arm was in a sling and he asked for assistance carrying something to his car. These were everyday scenarios, the kind of small social exchanges that happen hundreds of times a day on any campus. That was precisely Bundy's advantage. He understood that people's guard was lowest when they were doing something kind. By exploiting that kindness, Bundy created the perfect trap. Once a woman agreed to help, she would walk with him to his car. A Volkswagen Beetle, small and unassuming, parked just far enough from the main flow of people to provide privacy. From that moment on, she was in his territory. Bundy had planned the details. The doors, the seat arrangement, the tools hidden within reach. These were not crimes of sudden rage. They were carefully choreographed abductions, rehearsed in his mind until they became second nature. Even as these disappearances began to accumulate, Bundy's public image remained untarnished. When news of missing women spread across Washington, no one thought of Ted Bundy. Why would they? He was the volunteer at the crisis hotline, the aspiring lawyer, the polite young man everyone seemed to like. This disconnect between appearance and reality allowed him to keep striking without suspicion. In fact, he sometimes joined in the search efforts, handing out flyers or attending meetings about the missing women. This grotesque participation deepened the mask. He was not only a predator but a concerned citizen who seemed to care about the very victims he had created. For investigators at the time, the pattern was both confusing and alarming. Women were vanishing in broad daylight from public places, college campuses, parks, city streets. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no immediate witnesses who could describe an attacker. The only common thread was that each missing woman had last been seen talking to a man who matched a vague description. Tall, handsome, with a cast or sling, sometimes introducing himself as Ted. But the name Ted was common enough and the description too general to offer a clear lead. This period of Bundy's life illustrates how a predator can operate invisibly in the open. By choosing his moments carefully, by crafting a non-threatening persona, he was able to neutralize suspicion at every step. He didn't lurk in dark alleys. He approached women in places they felt safe. He didn't threaten them initially. He asked for help. He made them feel like the ones in control until, suddenly, they weren't. Behind closed doors, Bundy was also evolving emotionally. Each successful abduction reinforced his sense of power and mastery. He had crossed a line from which there was no return, and he knew it. Yet instead of guilt, he felt exhilaration. He was proving to himself that he could live two lives, that he could be the polite young man in public and the hidden predator in private. This sense of superiority, of being untouchable, grew stronger with each passing month. By the spring of 1974, the pattern of disappearances in Washington had become too obvious to ignore. Newspapers began running stories about missing college students. Fear spread on campuses. Women were advised not to walk alone, to be cautious of strangers with injuries, to trust their instincts. But Bundy was already adapting, changing his tactics, moving to new hunting grounds. The first shadows had appeared, but the full storm was still to come. The months that followed the first wave of disappearances in Washington were a study in quiet terror. Young women vanished in daylight from seemingly safe places, leaving behind little more than books, purses, or cars parked where they had left them. Students began to whisper about a man with a cast on his arm, or a sling, or a friendly smile who asked for help. The campus bulletin boards were crowded with warnings, but the face of the predator was still invisible. Ted Bundy, meanwhile, walked among the worried crowds, reading the notices, hearing the rumors, and feeling untouchable. Bundy's early crimes were marked by an eerie sense of control. Unlike impulsive attackers who lash out unpredictably, he planned meticulously. He scouted locations days or weeks in advance. He observed how foot traffic ebbed and flowed, where the parking lots were less monitored, and how women reacted to different kinds of approaches. Each abduction was the result of repeated dry runs, rehearsals of the role he would play. He might practice his limp, his tone of voice, his facial expression in front of a mirror until it seemed natural. When the moment came, he could perform without hesitation. One reason Bundy's crimes initially went unnoticed as a pattern was jurisdictional fragmentation. The missing women were from different towns, different campuses, sometimes different counties. Police departments didn't yet have the kind of communication systems we take for granted today. A case of a missing woman in Olympia might not be linked immediately to a similar case in Seattle. This lack of coordination allowed Bundy to exploit the cracks in law enforcement's reach. He understood those cracks and moved fluidly between them. As the spring of 1974 unfolded, the fear began to spread beyond Washington. Other young women disappeared in Oregon and later in Utah, always under similar circumstances. The fact that Bundy was willing to cross state lines made him harder to track. He was learning that mobility was a form of camouflage. If he struck in one place and then left quickly, police in the next jurisdiction would have no reason to suspect him. It was a predator's version of a traveling salesman's route, never staying in one market too long, always looking for the next opening. Yet what truly set Bundy apart was not just his planning but his performance. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleys but a man who approached women in the open, in broad daylight, and made them feel safe enough to walk away with him. Sometimes he pretended to be an injured student, sometimes a police officer, sometimes an authority figure with a plausible request. This tactic, appealing to empathy or deference, was so effective because it inverted the normal dynamics of fear. Women were taught to be wary of aggressive strangers, not of polite ones who seemed to need help. Bundy weaponized decency itself. In the aftermath of each disappearance, Bundy returned to his public life as though nothing had happened. He attended classes, showed up for work, and continued volunteering at the hotline. Coworkers remembered him laughing, telling jokes, appearing relaxed. If he read newspaper articles about the missing women, and he almost certainly did, he gave no outward sign of anxiety. This composure deepened the illusion of normalcy. He seemed incapable of the crimes he was secretly committing. For the victims' families, the period was one of mounting desperation. Flyers went up, search parties combed the areas where the women were last seen, and vigils were held. Police interviewed hundreds of people, chasing tips that led nowhere. Even when multiple witnesses mentioned a man named Ted, with a sling or cast driving a Volkswagen, the information felt too thin to act on. There were many Volkswagens, many men named Ted. Without physical evidence, suspicion could not stick. Bundy, meanwhile, was refining his techniques. Each successful abduction taught him something new about timing, about how to control a situation, about how to make himself appear harmless until the very last moment. He began to vary his approaches, changing details so as not to form too obvious a pattern. This adaptability made him even more dangerous. He was not just repeating the same crime, he was evolving as a predator. This period also revealed the psychological mechanism that allowed Bundy to maintain his double life. He compartmentalized. In one compartment, he stored his public identity, the aspiring lawyer, the civic volunteer. In another, he stored his crimes and fantasies. Between the two compartments, he built walls so high that he could step from one life to the other without appearing disoriented. Later, in prison, he would describe this as if he were two people, though whether that was genuine or another manipulation remains debated. What is clear is that this compartmentalization allowed him to commit acts of extraordinary cruelty without losing the composure needed to keep his cover intact. As the summer approached, the tension in Washington reached a breaking point. Students on campuses were advised to travel in pairs, to avoid parking lots at night, to be suspicious of strangers asking for help. But Bundy was already planning his next moves, shifting his focus to different states where his face was unknown. The first shadows of his crimes had appeared in the Pacific Northwest, but his ambition as a predator was national. He wanted not only to satisfy his compulsions but to prove to himself that he could outwit the entire system. These early, unnoticed crimes form a chilling chapter in Bundy's story because they show the predator at his most confident and least constrained. He had not yet been arrested, had not yet been identified, had not yet been forced to adapt to police scrutiny. He was still writing his own rules. In this freedom, he created the template that would define his later atrocities: charm, deception, and the exploitation of ordinary kindness. Each disappearance was not just a crime but a rehearsal for something larger. Chapter 4: The Disappearances. Women vanish without a trace. By the middle of 1974, what had started as isolated missing person cases was turning into a haunting pattern. Across Washington and Oregon, bulletin boards at colleges, grocery stores, and bus stops displayed photographs of smiling young women who had simply vanished. The notices carried the same words over and over: last seen, never arrived, if you have information. Yet behind the paper squares and fading ink, a far larger story was unfolding. One that would soon pull the entire nation into a collective nightmare. Ted Bundy, moving quietly between his law classes, volunteer shifts, and evening dates, appeared outwardly unchanged. Friends saw a man who talked about his future in politics, who dressed neatly and was generous with his time. He still worked at the crisis hotline, offering calm reassurance to strangers at their lowest moments. To the untrained eye, nothing about him suggested danger. But within him, the divide between his public mask and his private compulsions had widened into a chasm. Each successful abduction fed his confidence, and each success emboldened him to take greater risks. The Disappearances of 1974 showed how thoroughly Bundy had learned to exploit opportunity. He no longer confined himself to one university or one town. Instead, he treated the Pacific Northwest as his hunting ground. In January, a young woman named Linda and Healy vanished from her basement room near the University of Washington after a night out with friends. She was known for her punctuality and reliability, so when she failed to show up at work the next morning, alarm bells rang immediately. The scene in her room was strange but not obviously violent. Her bed neatly made, her things apparently untouched except for a missing nightgown and her absence. There was no sign of forced entry. Over the next months, more names would be added to the list: Donna Gail Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks. Each case bore small differences in circumstance but enough eerie similarities to trouble detectives. All were young, attractive students with long hair parted down the middle, a popular style of the time. All disappeared near campuses or places where students gathered. All were last seen speaking with a polite young man, sometimes described as having an arm in a sling or wearing a cast. Witnesses offered snippets: a Volkswagen parked nearby, a soft-spoken voice, a request for help with books or a sailboat or directions. None of these details alone was enough to identify a suspect, but together they painted the outline of a predator. What made Bundy's approach so effective was his understanding of social trust. In the 1970s, before the phrase serial killer was widely known, most people assumed danger came from strangers who looked dangerous, rough, aggressive, visibly threatening. Bundy inverted that expectation. He presented himself as clean-cut, educated, even vulnerable. By pretending to be injured or needing assistance, he engaged not only his victims' attention but their empathy. This tactic allowed him to move women voluntarily into secluded areas or his car without creating a scene. There were no screams, no immediate signs of abduction, only a friendly exchange that ended with a disappearance. The fear spreading across campuses was subtle at first, like a change in the weather. Women began traveling in pairs or groups. Campus security issued warnings about strangers. Police advised students not to accept rides from anyone they didn't know. Yet these precautions were undermined by the reality that the predator did not look like a predator. He looked like one of them. Some witnesses even remembered thinking the man named Ted seemed nice or trustworthy. The very qualities that should have reassured them were the ones being weaponized against them. Behind closed doors, investigators were struggling. The concept of a single individual committing multiple murders across jurisdictions was still unfamiliar to law enforcement. The FBI had not yet developed its behavioral science unit or formal profiles for such offenders. Detectives in Washington might have a suspect list entirely separate from those in Oregon or Utah. Without modern databases or instant communication, Connecting the dots was painstaking and slow. It would take years before the full scope of Bundy's crimes became visible. For Bundy, this confusion was an advantage. Each time he crossed a state line, he essentially reset the investigation clock. Local police would treat each disappearance as an isolated event. Without bodies recovered promptly and without witnesses who could give a precise description, there was little hard evidence. Even the Volkswagen Beetle, later so infamous, was one of the most common cars on the road. Nothing about it immediately screamed suspicion. Bundy blended into both the background and the foreground at once, visible enough to be remembered but too ordinary to be flagged. In the summer of 1974, his audacity peaked with the events at Lake Sammamish State Park, a sun-drenched public space near Seattle where thousands gathered for picnics and swimming. In a single day, Bundy approached multiple women in broad daylight, introducing himself as Ted and asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. Several refused, sensing something off, but two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared forever. This was not a nighttime abduction from a quiet parking lot. It was a bold strike in front of witnesses. The sheer confidence of it shocked even seasoned detectives once they pieced the story together. These disappearances were no longer isolated blips on a map. They were the signature of someone who understood both human psychology and law enforcement gaps. And yet, for all the patterns emerging, Bundy still seemed invincible. He continued his studies, maintained relationships, and even began a new romance. Friends described him as relaxed, playful, ambitious. He read the news about the disappearances like everyone else and said little. The contrast between the public man and the hidden predator was becoming starker with each month. It was not simply that Bundy could hide his crimes. He could thrive while committing them. This duality, student and killer, volunteer and predator, created an aura of mystery that would later fascinate criminologists, journalists, and the public alike. In 1974, however, it was still an unsolved riddle. Young women were disappearing into thin air, and a man named Ted with a friendly smile was moving one step ahead of everyone. By the time the summer of 1974 ended, the Ted sightings at Lake Sammamish had become the first real crack in Bundy's mask. For the first time, law enforcement had multiple independent witnesses who could describe the same man, the same car, and even the same name. Sketch artists produced a composite drawing. A handsome young man with wavy hair and a gentle expression. The sketches were posted around campuses, printed in newspapers, and distributed to police agencies. People who knew Bundy saw the resemblance. Some even called in tips. But the idea that the friendly law student and campaign volunteer could be responsible for such horrors seemed absurd to most. Even those who suspected him hesitated. How could someone so outwardly normal be a monster? Bundy watched all of this unfold with a gambler's calm. He changed his hairstyle, altered his routine, and kept moving. In September, he left Washington for Salt Lake City to enroll in the University of Utah's law school, a move that further complicated the investigations. Disappearances began in Utah almost as soon as he arrived. It was as though he had transported the fear with him. Within weeks, women in and around the university were vanishing under eerily familiar circumstances. For investigators, the migration of the crimes was bewildering. How could they link missing person cases separated by hundreds of miles and different jurisdictions? Without the kind of centralized criminal databases that exist today, it was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle without knowing if the pieces belonged to the same picture. Even the FBI, still developing its understanding of multi-state offenders, had limited reach. As a result, Bundy's crimes continued largely unchecked. What makes this period especially chilling is the ease with which Bundy adapted to new environments. In Utah, he played the part of the polite, out-of-state law student, making new friends and even dating local women. He attended church events, went skiing, and gave the impression of being just another ambitious young man. His social camouflage was so effective that when some Utah students saw the Ted composite sketch from Washington, they simply didn't connect it to the man sitting next to them in class. Bundy's pattern of luring women was also evolving. In Utah, he occasionally used the ruse of being a police officer or displaying a badge to gain compliance. This was a subtle but important shift. By invoking authority, he could override a victim's hesitation more quickly. It also revealed how attuned he was to his own notoriety. As the injured student persona became more recognizable, he experimented with new roles. This ability to improvise and refine his tactics kept him ahead of law enforcement for years. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Northwest, the families of missing women were left in limbo. Without bodies or confessions, there was little closure. Some clung to hope, believing their daughters might still be alive somewhere. Others sensed the worst but lacked proof. This ambiguous loss, the pain of not knowing, was one of Bundy's cruelest legacies. He not only destroyed lives but left behind trails of uncertainty that haunted families for decades. In the media, the story began to take shape as a mystery man terrorizing college towns. Newspapers printed timelines of disappearances, speculated about a possible connection, and urged caution. But without a clear suspect, the articles often blurred together as another frightening but unsolved crime wave. This ambiguity fed public anxiety while also giving Bundy more room to operate. He was reading these papers too, and each headline seemed to confirm his belief that he was untouchable. The fact that Bundy left so few traces is also instructive about the era's forensic limitations. DNA analysis was decades away. Surveillance cameras were rare. Fingerprints required a direct match, and without a prior arrest or a print left behind, there was nothing to compare. Bundy was careful about what he touched, how he transported victims, and where he left them. His understanding of evidence may have been intuitive rather than technical, but it was effective. He was committing modern serial crimes in a pre-modern investigative landscape. As 1974 closed, the cumulative effect of the disappearances was a kind of cultural shift. Women on campuses began carrying whistles, varying their routes, and making safety calls to friends. Parents worried about sending daughters to university. Yet even as fear rose, there was still a tendency to see each new case in isolation. People hoped the nightmare would end with one arrest somewhere, not realizing they were facing a single, highly mobile predator who could be anywhere at any time. Bundy's double life during this period is one of the most striking aspects of his story. In Utah, he dated a police officer's daughter, attended social gatherings, and maintained phone calls with his longtime girlfriend in Seattle. He juggled these relationships while committing abductions. This wasn't simply cold-bloodedness. It was a level of compartmentalization that criminologists still study. He could be charming over dinner one evening and predatory the next night without visible conflict. The performance was seamless, yet cracks were beginning to appear. Some women refused to go with him, sensing something wrong. Witness descriptions of his car and his name were becoming more consistent. Detectives in Washington were beginning to compile lists of men named Ted who drove Volkswagens. In Utah, some people noticed odd behaviors. Bundy's law school performance was faltering. His grades slipped, and professors found him distracted. Whether because of stress, compulsion, or arrogance, the mask was no longer perfect. This chapter of Bundy's life, these disappearances without trace, marks the height of his anonymity but also the beginning of his exposure. The very confidence that allowed him to abduct in broad daylight also produced witnesses and patterns. It was only a matter of time before law enforcement began to connect the dots. But in 1974, for the women he targeted, there was still no warning strong enough to break the spell of his charm. They met a man who seemed decent, helpful, maybe even a little shy, and then they vanished into a void that had no name yet in the public imagination. Chapter 5: The Killer Next Door. Bundy's life in public view. While police in Washington and Utah were painstakingly collecting scraps of information about a mysterious man named Ted, the man himself was living what, from the outside, looked like an enviable life. He rented small apartments in ordinary neighborhoods, took out library books, went grocery shopping, and exchanged pleasantries with neighbors. To those who shared hallways with him or bumped into him at the laundromat, he was just another young man trying to build a future. This ordinariness became one of Ted Bundy's greatest shields. Bundy understood the power of presentation. He didn't look like the caricature of a criminal from a crime show. He was tall, clean-cut, and articulate. He owned sports jackets and wore them easily. When he spoke, he used full sentences, he listened, he made eye contact. To the people he encountered in classrooms or on the street, he seemed polite, even a little earnest. It was a mask so convincing that even when friends saw the police sketch from Lake Sammamish, they found it difficult to believe it could be him. During this period, Bundy's social life flourished. In Salt Lake City, he attended church dances, met new friends, and began dating. At the same time, he maintained a long-distance relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother in Seattle who had been his girlfriend for years. They spoke on the phone, sent letters, and occasionally visited. She knew about his ambitions, his studies, his volunteer work. He seemed like a man with goals. The contrast between what Klopfer saw and what Bundy was actually doing on nights away from her is one of the starkest examples of his double life. His civic involvement added to the illusion. In Washington, he had worked at a suicide hotline alongside Rule, a former police officer turned writer who would later pen one of the most famous books about him. Callers to the hotline remembered a calm, reassuring male voice talking them through their crises. Bundy was genuinely skilled at sounding empathetic. The irony of a man saving lives on the phone while ending lives in secret is one of the details that made his case so disturbing once it became public. Even in Utah, as the disappearances began, Bundy seemed to go about his business without concern. He enrolled in law school, attended lectures, and took notes. Yet professors noted that his performance was lackluster compared to his peers. He seemed distracted, sometimes absent. What no one realized was that the distractions were not ordinary stress but the planning of crimes. Law school had become less about building a career and more about providing a socially acceptable backdrop for his movements. Neighbors and acquaintances saw only small quirks. His tendency to disappear for long drives, his shifting explanations for where he had been, his occasional mood swings. None of these alone would have marked him as dangerous. In an era without social media or digital footprints, it was easy to reinvent oneself city by city. Bundy exploited this, presenting a slightly different version of himself depending on his audience. Klopfer, however, began to sense something was wrong. She noticed odd items in his apartment, strange stories about his whereabouts, unexplained cash. When she saw news reports about the Ted linked to disappearances, she felt a chill of recognition. She even called the police with her suspicions more than once. But without hard evidence, her tips went into a stack of hundreds. The idea that her boyfriend, the man who played with her daughter and spoke about marriage, could be a predator was almost unthinkable even to her. The paradox of Bundy's public life was that it was both a mask and a training ground. The same charm that helped him secure jobs, friendships, and dates was the charm he used to lure victims. Each normal interaction was, in a way, practice. He learned how to read people, how to adjust his tone, how to mirror someone's expectations. He became a master of what criminologists later called impression management, the ability to present a tailored self to each person he encountered. This period also shows how Bundy thrived in environments of trust. In the 1970s, communities were more open. People hitchhiked, left doors unlocked, and assumed strangers were basically honest. In such a setting, someone like Bundy could seem like the perfect neighbor, friendly, helpful, unthreatening. Only when the pattern of disappearances emerged did people start to retroactively connect their casual encounters with something darker. By living so openly, Bundy also fed his own sense of invincibility. Each successful conversation with a neighbor, each polite handshake at a community event reinforced the belief that he could never be caught. He was, in his own mind, smarter than the police, smarter than the public, able to move through the world unseen even while standing in the middle of it. This confidence would eventually lead to mistakes, but in the mid-1970s it made him seem unstoppable. As the months passed, Ted Bundy's life in public view became a study in contrasts. Outwardly, he was a model student, polite, engaging, and socially adept. He attended classes, contributed to discussions, and made friends with ease. He was involved in campus activities and participated in volunteer work that reinforced the image of a compassionate, upstanding young man. To the untrained eye, he was a young adult pursuing ambition responsibly, embodying the kind of promise that many parents admired. Yet beneath this facade, Bundy's secret life was escalating. While students were attending lectures and office hours, he was thinking about his next move, refining his methods, considering new opportunities for abductions. The meticulous planning he invested in his private life was as structured as any professional project. He observed behavioral patterns, tested the effectiveness of different ruses, and adjusted his tactics based on what worked. In essence, he treated his crimes as experiments in human psychology, and himself as the master manipulator in social situations. Bundy's charm was deliberate. He had learned to appear empathetic, even vulnerable, in order to disarm those around him. He could smile warmly, laugh softly, and listen intently, behavior that suggested trustworthiness. This same charm was instrumental when approaching women in public spaces. It was a skill he practiced with friends and colleagues every day, creating a seamless continuity between the man the world saw and the predator hiding beneath. The duality of these lives allowed him to maintain a low profile while continuing to commit crimes. Bundy's relationships were also part of his dual persona. Elizabeth Klopfer, his long-term girlfriend in Seattle, had glimpses of his darker tendencies. She occasionally questioned inconsistencies in his stories, noticed odd items or unexplained absences, and at times felt a gnawing unease. Yet the man she saw most often, the man who called her, brought meals, and made plans for the future, appeared committed and loving. Bundy understood this psychological lever and exploited it, maintaining her trust while continuing to operate unchecked. The cognitive dissonance she experienced, trusting the man she knew, yet sensing something amiss, was a hallmark of Bundy's manipulative genius. His mobility added another layer to his invisibility. Moving between Washington, Oregon, and Utah, Bundy was able to restart his social and academic life in each new location, giving him fresh access to potential victims and keeping local authorities off balance. He attended different classes, joined different social circles, and established new routines that concealed his previous activities. In effect, he reset the social clock in each new environment, making it almost impossible for anyone to connect him to the string of disappearances. Bundy's mastery of public perception extended to law enforcement. He occasionally engaged casually with officers or participated in searches for missing women, always remaining in the spotlight while staying invisible. To authorities, he was helpful, cooperative, and articulate, never a person who would arouse suspicion. By volunteering his time, he gained insight into investigative procedures, learning what might alert officers and how to avoid detection. This level of foresight was not common among criminals and underscored his unusual combination of intelligence and psychopathy. Even in casual community interactions, Bundy's duality was on display. Neighbors remembered him smiling, carrying groceries, chatting politely. He was attentive, asking questions about their lives, appearing considerate and trustworthy. Yet the very ordinariness that made him likable was what allowed him to hide the extraordinary danger beneath. In every interaction, he reinforced his public persona while keeping his true intentions hidden, a delicate balancing act that required constant vigilance and psychological precision. The dissonance of Bundy's life in public view was also a reflection of his internal compartmentalization. Friends, colleagues, and even lovers only saw the parts of him he allowed them to see. Each compartment of his mind operated almost independently. One focused on charm, social advancement, and public life. The other focused on obsession, planning, and predation. This duality became a defining characteristic of Bundy's psychology and a central reason why he was able to evade capture for so long. By 1975, the tension of maintaining this duality began to escalate. Bundy's audacity in committing abductions increased, and he began traveling longer distances to avoid overlapping investigation zones. Yet at the same time, the world still largely perceived him as the young man next door, respectable, capable, and socially integrated. It was this tension between visibility and invisibility, charm and menace, that made Bundy's early life as a predator so terrifying in retrospect that in essence, Bundy had perfected the art of blending in. He could appear ordinary in a classroom, extraordinary in a volunteer setting, and utterly predatory when circumstances allowed. Each of these personas reinforced the others, creating a feedback loop of confidence and opportunity. By managing how the world perceived him, he was able to maintain the freedom to pursue his crimes while appearing untouchable. The irony of his public life: a young man admired, trusted, and respected while committing unspeakable acts, remains one of the most chilling aspects of his story. Chapter 6: Patterns of Predation. How Bundy chose his victims. By 1974 and 1975, the early disappearances had established an unsettling pattern, though most people did not yet see it. To law enforcement, the cases still appeared as isolated incidents, each a tragedy in its own right. To Ted Bundy, however, they were part of a carefully orchestrated strategy, an ongoing study in human behavior, vulnerability, and the art of manipulation. He was not haphazard in his choices. He selected his victims with deliberate care, shaping his predatory habits around what he had learned over years of observation. Bundy's victim profile was strikingly specific. Women were typically young, often college-aged, white, with slender builds and long hair parted in the middle, a style that reflected the era's popular aesthetic. This was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was a calculated decision based on psychological and social factors. By focusing on a consistent type, Bundy could predict reactions more accurately, test his approaches, and refine his techniques with each interaction. In essence, his victims became part of an experimental framework in which he was both the observer and the orchestrator. The process of choosing a target was never impulsive. Bundy's method relied on observation and timing. He would watch a campus library, a park, or a dormitory from a distance, noting the movements of students and assessing their responses to social interactions. He paid attention to body language, pace, and openness. Women who walked alone, carried books, or appeared approachable became potential targets. Even small behavioral cues could determine his decision. A smile, a glance, or a willingness to engage in casual conversation could mark the difference between opportunity and dismissal. Bundy's preferred techniques involved psychological manipulation rather than immediate physical force. He often employed ruses designed to make women feel compelled to assist him. Sometimes he feigned injury, such as a broken arm or a leg in a cast. Sometimes he pretended to be an authority figure like a police officer or a campus official. Occasionally, he used props such as books, a typewriter, or a sailboat to make his requests seem mundane. These manipulations were subtle, relying on the empathy and social conditioning of his targets rather than brute coercion. The use of a Volkswagen Beetle became central to his predatory system. The car's small size and nondescript appearance allowed him to transport victims without arousing suspicion. To the outside world, he was simply a student running errands, a neighbor moving belongings, or a young man carrying equipment. Inside the car, however, he had arranged his tools, props, and personal implements to facilitate abduction and concealment. This careful preparation exemplified the strategic and methodical nature of Bundy's criminal approach. Bundy's selection process also involved risk assessment. He learned which environments minimized the chances of being observed or interrupted. Libraries and campus buildings provided anonymity and easy access to students, while parking lots offered isolation and escape routes. He studied security patterns, noting when patrols changed shifts or when areas were sparsely populated. Even the timing of classes and social events could inform his decisions, creating windows of opportunity that he could exploit with minimal risk. One of the most chilling aspects of Bundy's method was how he leveraged trust as a weapon. By presenting himself as ordinary, relatable, or in need of assistance, he neutralized the natural caution that people might otherwise exercise. In doing so, he created a psychological environment where the victim's own social conditioning, being helpful, polite, or cooperative, worked against them. Bundy understood human psychology in ways that most people would never consider. Empathy and trust became instruments of his control. Another element of his strategy was repetition with variation. Bundy didn't merely repeat the same ruse in identical circumstances. He adjusted his methods to test responses. Some women were approached during daylight, others in the early evening. Some were asked to help carry items. Others were asked for directions or assistance with a task. Each interaction provided data that informed subsequent decisions, refining his approach to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure. Bundy's calculated focus on women fitting a specific profile meant that investigators could eventually identify a pattern once enough cases were analyzed. However, at the time, authorities were hindered by jurisdictional limits and lack of communication. Disappearances spanned cities, states, and even regional boundaries, making the overall pattern invisible to any single agency. In essence, Bundy's strategy exploited not only human psychology but also institutional gaps, allowing him to operate freely and seemingly without constraint. Even in his personal life, Bundy's thinking reflected the same pattern-oriented approach. His charm, attention to detail, and careful observation of others were practiced in both social and predatory contexts. Friends, classmates, and romantic partners all became part of his broader observational network, providing opportunities to test his social skills and hone the ability to read others quickly. The skills that made him successful socially were the very same skills that made him a methodical and dangerous predator. By analyzing the patterns of his predation, it becomes clear that Bundy's crimes were not simply impulsive acts of violence. They were the result of deliberate study, careful planning, and constant refinement. He understood the psychology of his victims, the vulnerabilities of social environments, and the limitations of law enforcement. Each abduction was part of a larger system, and each successful execution reinforced his belief in his own invincibility. This period, in which patterns became method and method became habit, marks a crucial stage in Bundy's transformation from troubled young man to one of America's most infamous serial killers. As 1975 progressed, Ted Bundy's methods became increasingly refined, reflecting not only his intelligence but also a meticulous attention to human behavior. He no longer relied solely on random opportunity. Instead, he crafted his abductions with precision, turning each encounter into a controlled experiment. This evolution marked the transition from opportunistic predator to systematic serial offender, and it underscored the terrifying combination of charm, calculation, and adaptability that made Bundy so dangerous. Bundy's evolving tactics relied heavily on his understanding of vulnerability. He recognized that isolation was a key factor in successful abductions, and he actively sought environments where women were alone or in sparsely populated areas. Dormitories, campus libraries, and parks became prime hunting grounds because they offered both access and plausible pretexts for interaction. He would often observe a potential victim from a distance, noting her movements, habits, and patterns before approaching. In this way, he minimized risk and maximized the likelihood of compliance. One of Bundy's signature techniques involved the use of deception to appear non-threatening. By presenting himself as a figure in need, an injured student, a campus official, or someone who seemed disoriented, he exploited both empathy and social conditioning. Women were conditioned to help those in apparent distress, and Bundy weaponized that instinct. This method allowed him to bypass suspicion entirely, transforming what would normally be a protective mechanism into a vulnerability. Each successful interaction reinforced the effectiveness of his approach. The Volkswagen Beetle, by now synonymous with his crimes, became more than just a tool. It was a mobile stage upon which his manipulations played out. Bundy arranged his car to facilitate rapid entry and exit, with strategic concealments for the materials he used and the victims themselves. The unassuming nature of the vehicle contributed to his ability to operate unnoticed. In public, it appeared ordinary, familiar even, blending seamlessly with other cars in parking lots and streets. Yet to those who became his targets, it was a trap carefully designed for entrapment and control. Bundy also learned the psychological importance of patience. He rarely forced immediate compliance. Instead, he nurtured situations that allowed the victim to make voluntary choices. By giving the illusion of control, he reduced resistance. A woman who willingly walked with him to his car was easier to manage than one who had been physically coerced. In essence, Bundy understood that consent, when manipulated, could become a tool of domination. His actions were chillingly methodical, blending charm and coercion into a seamless operation. Another factor in Bundy's evolving methods was his ability to adjust to environmental conditions. He learned to exploit seasonal patterns, campus schedules, and social events. For example, during spring and summer, when outdoor spaces and campus grounds were busier, he approached his targets with subtler tactics. In quieter winter months or late evenings, he experimented with more direct strategies. This adaptability demonstrated both his analytical mind and his willingness to learn from previous encounters. Adjusting his approach based on successes and failures, Bundy's social skills also played a critical role in his predation. His ability to charm, engage, and gain trust was not accidental. He studied human reactions and used subtle cues to manipulate emotions. A smile, a friendly tone, or a casual question could disarm suspicion entirely. He observed the effect of small gestures on women's responses, using these insights to improve his effectiveness. Even minor adjustments, a tilt of the head, the pacing of his speech, the angle of approach, could determine whether an interaction ended in compliance or rejection. The consistency of his victim profile also facilitated pattern recognition for himself. By focusing on a specific type, young, white, college-aged women with certain physical attributes, he could predict reactions more accurately and refine his approach to maximize control. This consistency was key to his efficiency as a predator. It allowed him to practice, adapt, and perfect techniques without introducing unnecessary variables. Each abduction became both a practical and psychological rehearsal for subsequent crimes. Even as Bundy's methods grew more sophisticated, his outward life remained undisturbed. He continued attending law school, maintained a relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer, and engaged with social circles as if he were an ordinary young man. This compartmentalization, separating the predator from the public persona, was both a psychological strategy and a survival mechanism. It allowed him to continue his crimes with minimal suspicion while presenting the appearance of normalcy to those around him. By refining his tactics, Bundy demonstrated a frightening level of foresight and adaptability. He was not merely a criminal responding to opportunity. He was a predator actively shaping situations to his advantage, learning from every encounter, and anticipating human reactions with precision. The evolution of his methods during this period marks one of the most critical stages in his criminal development. It is here that the combination of charm, intellect, and meticulous planning crystallized into a formula that would terrify multiple states over the following years. Bundy's ability to choose victims, manipulate social instincts, and adapt strategies highlights the intersection of intelligence, psychopathy, and obsession. Each element was essential to his continued evasion of law enforcement and the perpetuation of his crimes. By the mid-1970s, Ted Bundy had moved beyond the realm of opportunistic danger into the territory of a methodical, calculating, and highly adaptive serial predator, one whose skill in manipulating human psychology would leave a lasting imprint on criminology and the collective consciousness of America. Chapter 7: The investigation begins. Police scramble to connect the dots. By the mid-1970s, a sense of urgency began to grip law enforcement in the Pacific Northwest. Young women had been disappearing at an alarming rate, often under eerily similar circumstances, yet authorities had no concrete leads. Each case initially appeared isolated, handled by separate police departments with limited communication. Missing person reports trickled in, but patterns remained hidden beneath the surface. The investigators' scramble to connect the dots marked the beginning of a high-stakes game between a clever predator and the fragmented system tasked with stopping him. The challenges facing investigators were numerous. For one, the cases spanned multiple jurisdictions. A disappearance in Seattle was initially investigated independently from one in Olympia, and neither office had the tools to identify overlapping trends quickly. At the time, interagency databases were rudimentary, and communication relied on phone calls, letters, or sporadic meetings. There was no national mechanism to track serial offenders efficiently, and there was certainly no way to anticipate a perpetrator who traveled frequently and adapted his methods seamlessly. Ted Bundy exploited these gaps, using mobility as both a shield and a strategic advantage. Detectives began compiling profiles from the limited eyewitness accounts available. Many witnesses recalled a young man, approximately in his early to mid-20s, often described as polite, clean-cut, and articulate. Some mentioned the distinctive props: an arm in a sling, a cast, or other minor injuries. Others noted the same model of car, a Volkswagen Beetle, seen near the locations of disappearances. At first, these pieces of information seemed too vague to create a meaningful profile. There were countless Volkswagens on the road, and the name Ted was common. Yet, as the reports accumulated, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, one that hinted at a single orchestrated force behind the disappearances. Investigators turned to psychological profiling, though the field was still in its infancy. There was no formal serial killer profile widely recognized by law enforcement, but some officers began noticing behavioral consistencies. The man appeared to select victims based on opportunity, charm, and perceived compliance rather than physical confrontation. He exploited social norms, such as the instinct to assist someone in apparent distress. These insights, combined with witness descriptions, gradually began to paint a picture of a predator who was highly intelligent, manipulative, and methodical. A far cry from the impulsive, erratic criminals many officers were accustomed to handling. One early breakthrough came with reports from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described two young women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, being approached by a polite young man asking for assistance with a sailboat. The description of the man, along with his vehicle, bore similarities to previous reports in Seattle and surrounding areas. Police began to realize that these incidents were likely connected. This realization sparked an unprecedented level of coordination between departments, although the tools to fully track a mobile predator were still limited. In parallel, local media played a role in shaping public awareness. Newspapers ran stories detailing the disappearances, often accompanied by sketches or composite drawings derived from witness accounts. These reports increased vigilance among students and residents, but they also inadvertently gave Bundy insight into the growing level of scrutiny. He read the reports with interest, noting the details shared with the public, and used them to further refine his methods. The interplay between media coverage and criminal adaptation became a subtle yet critical component of his evolving pattern of evasion. One of the difficulties for investigators was the lack of physical evidence. Crime scenes often revealed little more than personal belongings, books, clothing, or other small items, but rarely a body or clear forensic traces. Without modern DNA analysis or surveillance technology, police had limited avenues to pursue the suspect. Witnesses often provided fragmented memories, and the description of a tall, attractive man was frustratingly generic. Each lead required painstaking cross-referencing, interviews, and verification, consuming resources that were already stretched thin. Despite these challenges, law enforcement began to explore behavioral patterns more rigorously. They noticed that the missing women were often last seen walking alone, approached by a man who seemed trustworthy, polite, and unthreatening. The pattern suggested premeditation and careful planning. Investigators began to develop preliminary psychological profiles, considering traits such as charm, manipulativeness, intelligence, and social skill. They hypothesized that the perpetrator might be a law student or someone familiar with academic environments, someone capable of blending into ordinary settings without raising suspicion. Detectives also started compiling vehicle reports and examining Volkswagen registrations, though this task was massive and time-consuming. It involved checking lists of Beetle owners across multiple counties, tracing movements, and attempting to match sightings with known schedules or addresses. Each new disappearance added complexity, and investigators struggled to balance urgency with procedural caution. Meanwhile, Bundy continued to operate, watching, learning, and adapting. The very measures police were taking to catch him provided feedback that he could use to improve his own methods of evasion. The investigation's early phase highlights the limitations of mid-1970s law enforcement when confronting a highly intelligent, mobile, and manipulative predator. Bundy's ability to maintain a credible public persona, coupled with his methodical approach to abductions, allowed him to stay steps ahead of the authorities. Yet the emergence of patterns, witness accounts, and media attention created the foundation for eventual breakthroughs. This stage marked the critical point at which a puzzle of isolated incidents began to transform into the unmistakable portrait of a serial killer. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement began to understand the magnitude of the task before them. Multiple missing person cases, each with its own set of witnesses, physical evidence, and circumstantial details, needed to be reconciled across jurisdictions. Detectives realized that the killer was not only mobile but also exceptionally careful. He had established a pattern that was difficult to track, blending charm, opportunity, and foresight to remain invisible. The detectives faced a new and unsettling reality. They were dealing with a criminal who was not just dangerous, but extraordinarily intelligent. Early leads came sporadically, often frustratingly incomplete. Witnesses recalled fleeting details: a man named Ted helping with a typewriter, a limp, a Volkswagen parked near a campus library, or a polite request for assistance in moving books. Each detail by itself seemed insignificant, but when combined with other reports, a more coherent picture began to emerge. Law enforcement realized they were no longer investigating isolated disappearances. They were dealing with a methodical predator who operated across state lines, selecting victims with precision and exploiting social norms to his advantage. Yet the investigation was hindered by structural limitations. Police departments were accustomed to dealing with crimes within their local boundaries, not calculating the movements of a serial offender who adapted his approach to each new environment. Coordination was painstaking, requiring repeated calls, letters, and in-person meetings between agencies. While this communication eventually laid the groundwork for a broader understanding of the threat, in real time it allowed Bundy to exploit gaps, moving from one city to another with minimal risk of detection. One of the most significant frustrations for investigators was the absence of physical evidence. At each location, Bundy left only faint traces: an abandoned personal item, the faint impression of a footprint, or a vehicle parked in a lot at an unusual time. Without bodies or direct forensic connections, authorities struggled to link disappearances conclusively to a single individual. Every lead required careful verification, interviews with potential witnesses, and repeated cross-checking with other reports. For a criminal who had mastered discretion, this delay provided him with crucial breathing room. Despite these challenges, law enforcement began to explore behavioral patterns more deliberately. They noticed the similarities in victim profiles, the use of deception to gain compliance, and the calculated selection of locations. These observations formed the basis of early psychological sketches, prototypes of what would later become formalized criminal profiling. Even at this stage, detectives recognized that the individual they were seeking was not impulsive but intelligent, patient, and highly manipulative. Media involvement further complicated the investigation. Newspapers printed composite sketches and descriptions of the suspect, heightening public awareness. Parents, students, and local communities became vigilant, often calling in tips based on sightings or suspicions. While this publicity increased safety awareness, it also provided Bundy with insight into what authorities knew and what the public feared. He studied the reports, adjusted his tactics, and remained steps ahead, learning from the information that was meant to constrain him. The investigation's first breakthroughs came from witness testimonies that described the man consistently. Details such as a limp, a friendly demeanor, and the Volkswagen Beetle began to form a recognizable pattern. Police compiled these fragments into a more comprehensive understanding, yet there were still gaps, many of them large enough to allow Bundy to continue operating. Each new disappearance was a reminder of the limitations of the investigative tools available at the time. Law enforcement also began to realize the importance of interagency collaboration. Officers from different jurisdictions held meetings to compare notes, looking for overlaps in victim profiles, methods, and timelines. While this coordination eventually proved essential, in the early stages it was slow and uneven. Bundy, ever observant, seemed to intuit the boundaries of the system, moving into areas just beyond the reach of coordinated policing. His mobility and adaptability were a direct challenge to the traditional law enforcement paradigm. The growing awareness among investigators that a single predator could be responsible for the string of disappearances marked a pivotal turning point. It shifted the focus from isolated cases to a broader, strategic understanding of the criminal's behavior. This realization set the stage for more advanced profiling, surveillance, and eventually the nationwide manhunt that would define Bundy's later years. In retrospect, the early investigations, with their frustrations and partial breakthroughs, illustrate both the ingenuity of law enforcement in a pre-digital era and the extraordinary skill of a man who had learned to exploit human and institutional weaknesses. By the end of this initial investigative phase, authorities were beginning to see the outlines of a man who was extraordinarily ordinary in appearance yet extraordinary in danger. They could sense the patterns, sketch the approximate profile, and recognize the behavioral consistencies, but they lacked the decisive evidence needed to make an arrest. The stage was set for a high-stakes pursuit, a battle between meticulous planning and dogged investigation, between a killer hiding in plain sight and the law determined to catch him. Chapter 8: The Abduction Tactics Refined. Daylight and Deception. By 1975, Ted Bundy had begun to refine his methods with unnerving precision. The early disappearances, while frightening, had been exploratory in nature. Tests of opportunity, charm, and the willingness of strangers to assist him. Each abduction provided data that he could analyze, shaping the techniques he would later employ with terrifying efficiency. He had evolved from opportunistic predator to strategic planner, understanding that success relied not merely on chance but on careful preparation, timing, and psychological manipulation. Bundy's approach was defined by subtlety and patience. He no longer relied solely on isolated, impulsive encounters. Instead, he actively sought situations in which his targets were already vulnerable yet unsuspecting. Libraries, parks, campus buildings, and bus stops became stages for carefully orchestrated interactions. He studied the environment meticulously, noting the location of potential witnesses, escape routes, and isolated spots where an encounter could unfold without interference. Every variable was calculated to reduce risk and increase control. Daylight abductions became a hallmark of this period, demonstrating a boldness that many found almost inconceivable. Unlike the stereotypical predator who lurks in shadows, Bundy operated in plain view, often during times when campuses were bustling with students and families were nearby. He understood that ordinary environments, filled with people, could paradoxically offer the best cover. In the midst of activity, no one expected danger, and a polite, friendly young man could approach with minimal suspicion. The audacity of his methods amplified his sense of invincibility, reinforcing the belief that he could operate without fear of detection. One of Bundy's most effective tactics was deception. He perfected the art of appearing harmless or even in need of help. At times he feigned injury, wearing a cast or sling to appear vulnerable. Other times he pretended to be an authority figure, a police officer, or a campus worker, exploiting trust and social conventions. These carefully constructed personas allowed him to manipulate the reactions of his targets, creating an illusion of choice. Women who might have resisted a stranger's request were instead persuaded to comply voluntarily, turning social norms into instruments of control. Bundy also used props to make his requests more convincing. He carried books, typewriters, or other objects as excuses for needing assistance. He would approach with a calm, friendly demeanor, asking for help lifting items, moving objects, or providing directions. In these seemingly mundane interactions, the seeds of danger were hidden. The ordinary tasks he presented created a veneer of normalcy, lowering defenses and masking his intentions. Every action was rehearsed, intentional, and adaptive. The Volkswagen Beetle, by now a consistent element in his crimes, functioned as more than transportation. It was an extension of his manipulative strategy. Small and inconspicuous, the car allowed Bundy to transport victims without drawing attention. Inside, he could maintain control, conceal his actions, and manage variables. For witnesses, the vehicle seemed unremarkable. A student's car parked near a campus or a small commuter vehicle on a city street. For Bundy, it was an essential tool that facilitated both mobility and concealment. Another refinement involved observation and timing. Bundy often spent hours watching potential victims before making a move. He noted patterns of movement, behavior under social stress, and reactions to other strangers. This surveillance allowed him to select targets who were most likely to respond predictably to his manipulations. He tested his approaches in minor interactions, gauging reactions, adjusting his demeanor, and learning which tactics were most effective. Each successful engagement reinforced his methodology, creating a cycle of refinement that made him increasingly dangerous. Bundy's psychological insight into his victims was a key factor in his success. He understood how empathy, social conditioning, and politeness could be exploited. Women were taught to assist, to respond kindly to requests, and to trust a friendly demeanor. Bundy weaponized these instincts, turning the very qualities society prized in its citizens into vulnerabilities. His ability to anticipate behavior allowed him to manipulate choices subtly, creating an illusion of consent while removing real agency. Even as he honed these methods, Bundy maintained his public persona. He continued law school, maintained relationships, and engaged socially, presenting the image of a respectable, ambitious young man. This dual life, predator in public and hidden killer in private, required constant attention and psychological compartmentalization. The success of his daylight abductions depended not just on charm or planning, but on the careful management of his dual identity. Each part of his life reinforced the other, providing both camouflage and opportunity. By the end of this phase, Bundy had developed a system that was both elegant and horrifying in its efficiency. The combination of observation, deception, psychological manipulation, and careful planning allowed him to operate in broad daylight with minimal risk. Each abduction became a study in human behavior, a calculated interaction designed to exploit social norms and vulnerabilities. This period of refinement set the stage for the escalation of his crimes and the eventual nationwide pursuit that would follow, illustrating the terrifying effectiveness of a mind both intelligent and remorseless. Bundy's ability to exploit trust became the cornerstone of his refined tactics. By mid-1975, he had developed an almost intuitive understanding of human psychology, allowing him to manipulate his victims with subtle gestures, carefully chosen words, and the appearance of vulnerability. He was not physically imposing or overtly threatening. Instead, He relied on the social expectation that people should help, sympathize, or respond politely. In every interaction, he turned ordinary social norms into instruments of control, creating an environment in which his victims complied without perceiving danger. The art of persuasion involved multiple layers. Bundy knew that women were more likely to assist someone they believed to be polite, helpless, or familiar. He would often approach with a limp or carry an object, framing the interaction as a simple request for help. The props and behaviors were carefully rehearsed, almost theatrical. By appearing dependent, he created the illusion of harmlessness, lowering defenses before initiating an abduction. In essence, he weaponized empathy, turning kindness into vulnerability. Bundy also experimented with authority as a tool. He sometimes presented himself as a police officer, security officer, or campus official. Authority carries inherent trust, and he leveraged this to circumvent natural caution. Women were conditioned to comply with requests from figures of authority, and Bundy's carefully cultivated appearance and demeanor amplified this effect. By combining charm, casual friendliness, and the suggestion of legitimacy, he neutralized suspicion and ensured compliance. Observation was another critical component of his strategy. Before approaching a potential victim, Bundy would often watch from a distance, studying patterns of movement, timing, and behavior. He noted who walked alone, who appeared distracted, and who responded predictably to social cues. Each observation informed his approach, allowing him to select targets most likely to yield predictable outcomes. This patience and attention to detail made him exceptionally effective, demonstrating a level of premeditation and calculation that was highly unusual among criminals of the era. The use of the Volkswagen Beetle continued to play a key role. Small, unremarkable, and common, it allowed Bundy to blend seamlessly into ordinary surroundings. He arranged the car to facilitate rapid entry and exit, ensuring that each abduction could occur swiftly and with minimal attention. The vehicle was a controlled environment, enabling him to maintain dominance and concealment once the victim was inside. It was a critical extension of his methodical approach, combining logistics with psychological manipulation. Bundy's methods were not static. He constantly adapted based on successes, failures, and external conditions. He adjusted his timing, approach, and even his social persona depending on the environment. Campus buildings, dormitories, parks, and isolated streets each required a different strategy. He learned to read subtle reactions, hesitation, body language, and eye contact, and modify his behavior accordingly. Every interaction became a form of experimentation, providing feedback that allowed him to perfect his methods. This period also illustrates Bundy's mastery of duality. While orchestrating abductions in public spaces, he maintained the appearance of normalcy in his daily life. He attended classes, social events, and volunteer work without arousing suspicion. This compartmentalization was essential. By sustaining a credible public identity, he created a protective layer of social camouflage. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues saw only the affable, ambitious young man. Completely unaware of the predator operating in parallel, Bundy's tactics were reinforced by his own intelligence and self-confidence. Each successful abduction validated his methods, enhancing both skill and audacity. He became increasingly bold, willing to operate in busier public areas and even refining his techniques to require less risk and exertion. His confidence in his ability to manipulate perception, combined with a keen understanding of social behavior, made him a formidable adversary for law enforcement, which still lacked the tools to track and apprehend him. Even as investigators began to notice patterns across multiple disappearances, Bundy's dual life allowed him to evade suspicion. The public persona he carefully cultivated, charming, polite, socially engaged, made it nearly impossible for ordinary witnesses to connect him to the crimes. By maintaining this contrast between outward normalcy and hidden menace, he created a protective psychological and social shield that allowed his predatory methods to continue uninterrupted. By the end of this period, Bundy had perfected a system that combined charm, deception, patience, and observation. His daylight abductions, carefully calculated manipulations, and exploitation of social trust marked the transition from a predator testing opportunities to a methodical serial killer operating with precision and foresight. The effectiveness of these techniques illustrates a chilling reality. Bundy was not simply a criminal of impulse, but a master manipulator whose understanding of human psychology allowed him to operate in plain sight for years before the net of law enforcement began to close around him. Chapter 9: The First Capture. Arrest and the Trial That Shook America. By 1975, the net of law enforcement was slowly tightening around Ted Bundy. His carefully cultivated freedom was beginning to fray as investigators connected the dots between disappearances, vehicle sightings, and eyewitness accounts. While he had previously operated with near-total impunity, the first tangible confrontations with the law marked a turning point, revealing both his cunning and his vulnerability. The events leading to his first capture were tense, dramatic, and ultimately transformative in the story of one of America's most infamous serial killers. Bundy's initial arrest occurred in Utah. After a combination of eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence linked him to suspicious activity near a college campus. Officers had become increasingly aware of a pattern: young women disappearing under circumstances that involved a polite young man, often in a Volkswagen Beetle. When Bundy was stopped, he appeared cooperative, calm, and composed, presenting the image of an ordinary, law-abiding young man. This outward demeanor would become a defining characteristic of his interactions with law enforcement throughout his criminal career. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic in its ordinary appearance. Bundy was polite, answering questions without agitation, offering explanations for his presence and movements. He smiled and nodded, displaying no overt signs of panic. To the officers observing him, there was nothing in his manner that suggested the depth of danger he represented. Yet beneath this calm exterior lay a mind racing to calculate, manipulate, and adapt. Bundy's charm, which had been a weapon against potential victims, now became a shield against suspicion, as he subtly gauged the reactions of the officers around him. At the time of the arrest, authorities were not fully aware of the scope of Bundy's crimes. The investigation had yet to establish a direct link to the series of disappearances, and forensic science of the era offered few tools to prove guilt definitively. Bundy's intelligence and careful planning meant that physical evidence was minimal, and witnesses could only provide fragmentary accounts. Nevertheless, the arrest represented a significant step in containing his movements and gathering critical information. During interviews and preliminary questioning, Bundy demonstrated his characteristic combination of composure and manipulation. He offered plausible explanations for his presence in areas where disappearances had occurred, presenting himself as helpful and cooperative. Investigators, initially uncertain, found themselves confronting the duality of a man who could appear both ordinary and extraordinary, both charming and chilling, depending on context. It was a psychological balancing act that would become a recurring theme in his interactions with the criminal justice system. The arrest also highlighted the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Bundy's mobility, intelligence, and social skills had allowed him to evade detection across multiple jurisdictions. Even when confronted directly, he relied on plausible deniability, careful speech, and strategic omissions to obscure incriminating details. Each interview became a subtle contest of perception, with Bundy assessing reactions, identifying weaknesses, and calibrating his responses. To officers, it appeared as though they were speaking with a cooperative young man, entirely unaware that they were interacting with a calculating predator. Despite these challenges, the arrest laid the groundwork for more aggressive investigative measures. Detectives began re-examining prior disappearances, seeking connections that could link Bundy to multiple incidents. They scrutinized vehicle registrations, cross-referenced eyewitness accounts, and looked for behavioral consistencies. This effort required painstaking coordination, as cases were spread across states and handled by different departments. Each piece of information brought investigators closer to understanding the extent of Bundy's crimes, while simultaneously increasing pressure on him to maintain his carefully constructed facade. Bundy's initial court appearances were equally striking. He maintained his composure, presenting himself as articulate, intelligent, and cooperative. This public image, so skillfully cultivated, contrasted sharply with the severity of the charges he faced. Observers and journalists noted his calm demeanor, his polite responses, and his ability to present himself convincingly in a courtroom setting. To many, this disparity was almost surreal. A man accused of heinous acts appearing so ordinary, so self-assured, and so composed throughout this period, Bundy continued to exploit both psychology and social perception. He understood that law enforcement and the courts were reliant on evidence, testimony, and procedural rigor. By presenting himself as rational, intelligent, and cooperative, he subtly influenced perceptions, delaying suspicion and complicating the investigative process. This strategic use of charm and composure became a recurring theme in his life after arrest, demonstrating the extent to which psychological manipulation had become integral to his survival and continued evasion. The first capture of Ted Bundy thus represents a critical inflection point. It was the moment when his carefully maintained freedom was first interrupted by law enforcement, and yet it also underscored the limitations of conventional investigative tools against a predator of his intelligence and cunning. For Bundy, the arrest was not a defeat but an opportunity, a situation to navigate, manipulate, and survive. For investigators, it marked the beginning of a protracted struggle to gather evidence, connect cases, and ultimately understand the full scope of the threat they were confronting. Once Ted Bundy's arrest had been made, the stage was set for a confrontation unlike any law enforcement had seen before. The courtroom became a theater in which intellect, charm, and danger collided, and where the public could witness the unsettling duality that had defined Bundy's life. Observers, both inside and outside the legal system, were captivated by the stark contrast between the horrific nature of the crimes and the composed, articulate demeanor of the accused. It was a spectacle that challenged perceptions of criminality, psychology, and human trust. Bundy's court appearances revealed a calculated performance. He dressed meticulously, spoke clearly, and engaged with legal proceedings with a confidence that many found unsettling. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike were aware of the subtle psychological game he was playing. Every gesture, every carefully chosen phrase, every polite interaction with the court staff and jury was designed to reinforce the image of the rational, respectable man. To the casual observer, he was an anomaly, accused of heinous acts, yet appearing calm, charming, and even sympathetic. The prosecution faced a formidable challenge. Evidence was often circumstantial, witnesses' memories were fragmented, and Bundy's ability to present plausible explanations for his presence or actions made it difficult to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Investigators had begun to connect disappearances across multiple states, But the fragmented nature of these cases complicated the narrative they needed to present in court. Bundy's intelligence and social skill amplified these challenges, turning the trial into a battle not only over facts but over perception itself. Witnesses were crucial in constructing a case. Friends, neighbors, and those who had interacted with Bundy provided accounts that highlighted his charm, manipulative tendencies, and suspicious behavior. Yet even these testimonies were sometimes undermined by his public persona. Many found it difficult to reconcile the image of the polite, helpful young man they had known with the allegations being presented. This tension between perception and reality became a recurring theme in the courtroom, emphasizing the extraordinary nature of Bundy's dual life. Bundy's own statements during the trial demonstrated both composure and cunning. He was careful to answer questions in ways that appeared cooperative but strategically vague, providing enough information to seem forthcoming without creating self-incrimination. His legal knowledge, cultivated through law school, allowed him to navigate procedural complexities with ease. Each interaction was measured, calculated to maintain an aura of credibility while simultaneously protecting him from direct liability. In essence, he treated the courtroom as another stage for his manipulative expertise. Media coverage of the trial amplified Bundy's notoriety. Journalists and television crews portrayed him as charismatic and unsettlingly normal, creating a paradoxical public fascination. He became a figure of intrigue, his calm intelligence juxtaposed against the horrifying crimes attributed to him. This coverage, while intended to inform, inadvertently contributed to his mythos, highlighting the disturbing reality of a man who could operate in plain sight for years while committing acts of unimaginable violence. Throughout the trial, Bundy's manipulative tendencies were on full display. He subtly influenced jurors, engaged with attorneys strategically, and maintained a demeanor that masked both arrogance and menace. His ability to control perception, a skill honed through years of predation, allowed him to navigate the courtroom with minimal visible strain. Observers were left to reconcile the incongruity of a man who could inspire both fear and fascination, horror and admiration for his intelligence, in a single sitting. The courtroom drama also illuminated the limitations of the investigative and legal systems of the era. With evidence scattered across jurisdictions and investigative tools lacking the sophistication of modern forensic science, prosecutors faced an uphill battle. Bundy's intelligence and meticulous preparation exploited these weaknesses, demonstrating how a cunning mind could manipulate both social norms and legal processes. Each procedural hurdle highlighted the interplay between human perception, institutional limitations, and criminal ingenuity. For law enforcement, the trial was a critical learning period. Investigators gained insight into Bundy's methods, his psychological profile, and the intricate planning behind his crimes. Testimonies, cross-examinations, and Bundy's own behavior offered a window into the mind of a predator who had operated undetected for years. Each observation informed subsequent investigative strategies, shaping the approach to future abductions, evidence collection, and interagency cooperation. The first trial and court appearances of Ted Bundy were thus more than a legal proceeding. They were a confrontation with the nature of human deception, intelligence, and evil. The public witnessed a man who could charm, manipulate, and appear credible while facing allegations of unimaginable cruelty. The courtroom became a microcosm of Bundy's life, a delicate balance of perception, reality, and hidden menace. It set the stage for the intense legal battles, escapes, and nationwide pursuit that would define the next chapter of his criminal career. By the end of this phase, it was clear that Bundy was not only a formidable predator, but also a master of social and psychological manipulation. His ability to operate within the legal system, while facing charges that could have ended his freedom, reinforced the chilling reality of his intelligence and cunning. The trial, dramatic and unnerving, marked both a confrontation and a prelude, hinting at the relentless tension between predator and pursuer that would dominate the years to come. Chapter 10: Escapes and the Growing Manhunt. Bundy on the loose. The arrest and trial of Ted Bundy were not the end of his story. They marked the beginning of a more audacious and terrifying chapter. Despite being in custody, Bundy's intelligence, cunning, and ability to manipulate perception allowed him to exploit weaknesses in the legal system, leading to a series of escapes that shocked the nation. These events would intensify the manhunt, increase public fear, and transform Bundy's reputation from a dangerous criminal to an almost legendary figure in the American consciousness. Bundy's first escape occurred in Colorado in 1977, while he was being held on suspicion of multiple murders. He was housed in a local courthouse for preliminary proceedings, a standard procedure at the time. Security was minimal by modern standards, and Bundy quickly identified vulnerabilities. Courthouses were open environments, often allowing prisoners to move under supervision in predictable patterns. Bundy's meticulous observation allowed him to exploit these conditions, turning routine procedures into opportunities for flight. The escape itself was a combination of careful planning, psychological manipulation, and bold action. Bundy, familiar with the routines of courthouse staff and law enforcement officers, timed his movements to take advantage of distractions and procedural gaps. Using charm and confidence, he persuaded staff to allow him certain freedoms, gradually creating an environment in which he could disappear without immediate detection. His ability to read and influence others was crucial, demonstrating that his predatory skill extended beyond the act of abduction into the realm of manipulation and strategic planning. Once free, Bundy disappeared into the local community, moving swiftly and quietly. His understanding of geography, transportation, and human behavior allowed him to evade capture for days, despite law enforcement's immediate response. He blended seamlessly with ordinary citizens, taking advantage of his ordinary appearance, intelligence, and calculated demeanor. This escape, widely publicized, created an atmosphere of both panic and fascination. The public was beginning to realize that Bundy was not merely a criminal who could be contained, but a man capable of exploiting the very institutions designed to hold him accountable. Bundy's escapes were not impulsive but highly premeditated. He observed routines, identified weaknesses, and practiced behaviors that would facilitate evasion. Each escape reinforced his confidence, teaching him that rules and restrictions could be circumvented through intelligence, patience, and manipulation. The success of these escapes also fueled his sense of invulnerability, encouraging bolder actions and heightening the threat he posed to communities across multiple states. The manhunt that followed was unprecedented in scale and complexity. Law enforcement agencies across state lines coordinated efforts to track him, sharing information on his appearance, vehicle sightings, and potential destinations. Media coverage amplified both the fear and the fascination, keeping Bundy's name in the headlines while providing him with insights into the public perception and investigative priorities. He observed this coverage carefully, using it to adjust his movements, avoid detection, and maintain the appearance of invisibility. Bundy's ability to exploit procedural weaknesses revealed significant limitations in law enforcement at the time. Communication between departments was slow, databases were fragmented, and resources for tracking a mobile, intelligent fugitive were limited. Bundy understood these gaps intuitively, navigating jurisdictional boundaries and exploiting delays in information flow. His escapes were not just acts of physical evasion but demonstrations of strategic intelligence, exploiting both human and institutional vulnerabilities. During his time on the loose, Bundy continued to study human behavior with the same meticulous attention he had applied to selecting victims. He observed law enforcement, witnesses, and ordinary citizens, learning how people reacted under pressure, what actions drew attention, and which behaviors could be used to mislead or manipulate. Even while a fugitive, he treated his environment as an experimental field, gathering data that informed both immediate survival and future criminal activity. Public response to Bundy's escapes was a mixture of horror, fascination, and disbelief. Families of victims feared for the safety of others, while communities grappled with the knowledge that a calculating and dangerous predator was roaming freely. Media coverage turned Bundy into a household name, amplifying the psychological impact of his actions and cementing his place in the national consciousness as a criminal who could not be contained easily. Despite the intensity of the manhunt, Bundy's intelligence, planning, and social skills allowed him to evade capture for weeks. Each day he remained free increased both the urgency of law enforcement efforts and the perception of him as an almost untouchable figure. His escapes highlighted a disturbing truth. Intelligence, charm, and meticulous planning could, in some cases, outmatch the procedural and technological limitations of the time. By the end of this phase, it was clear that Bundy's ability to escape custody and manipulate situations was more than luck. It was a testament to his methodical approach, strategic thinking, and psychological insight. The manhunt had intensified, the nation was on edge, and Bundy's reputation as a dangerous, intelligent, and elusive predator was firmly established. His escapes were not merely sensational episodes. They were a chilling demonstration of his capacity to adapt, manipulate, and remain a step ahead of authorities, setting the stage for the events that would follow in his later crimes and eventual capture. After Ted Bundy's initial escape, the intensity of the manhunt escalated dramatically. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were now coordinating efforts in a way that had rarely been seen in American criminal history. The public, alarmed by both the daring of his escapes and the ongoing disappearances, became an unintentional partner in the hunt. Media coverage amplified fear, disseminating his name and image while simultaneously giving Bundy insight into how authorities and citizens perceived him. This interplay of evasion and observation underscored his extraordinary adaptability and cunning. The nationwide manhunt required a level of coordination that pushed law enforcement beyond traditional investigative boundaries. Police departments, state patrols, and federal agencies shared descriptions, vehicle registrations, and eyewitness accounts in an attempt to track his movements. Yet despite these efforts, Bundy's mobility and intelligence allowed him to stay several steps ahead. He understood the limitations of interjurisdictional communication, exploiting the time delays inherent in 1970s law enforcement infrastructure. By carefully observing patterns of pursuit, he could anticipate where officers would focus their attention and deliberately avoid detection. Bundy's escapes were not merely physical, they were psychological. He had an acute sense of human behavior and institutional procedure, and he used both to his advantage. Courthouse staff, jail personnel, and even officers of the law were unwittingly manipulated through his calm demeanor, polite speech, and seemingly cooperative attitude. His ability to maintain composure under scrutiny created a psychological buffer, allowing him to act boldly without drawing immediate suspicion. Every interaction, every observation was part of a larger strategy of evasion. Media coverage played a dual role in this phase. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and radio alerts heightened public awareness, warning citizens to be vigilant. Yet, at the same time, the coverage gave Bundy clues about which tactics were most likely to draw attention and which could be exploited. He studied reports, monitored descriptions of his appearance, and adjusted his methods accordingly. The more authorities and media attempted to contain him, the more Bundy learned, adapting his movements, disguise, and approach to minimize exposure. The manhunt also exposed the vulnerabilities of the criminal justice system. Fragmented communication between jurisdictions, lack of centralized databases, and procedural inefficiencies created opportunities for Bundy to exploit. His intelligence allowed him to identify these gaps intuitively, using them as tactical advantages. For example, the knowledge that different counties maintained separate records of vehicle registrations or that reports of suspicious behavior were slow to reach neighboring states allowed him to operate across state lines with minimal risk of capture. While Bundy remained on the run, his audacity escalated. Reports surfaced of him traveling extensively, seeking new areas where law enforcement presence was limited and where victims could be isolated. His ability to blend into ordinary settings, college campuses, libraries, and public spaces, made him almost invisible, even as authorities mobilized massive resources to find him. Each successful period of freedom reinforced his confidence, solidifying the notion that his intelligence, planning, and understanding of human behavior could outmatch the procedural limitations of law enforcement. The psychological impact on the public was profound. Citizens became hyper-aware of their surroundings, and young women were warned repeatedly about the threat posed by a seemingly ordinary man with extraordinary cunning. Communities organized watch groups, increased security measures, and scrutinized unfamiliar individuals. Bundy, however, had internalized this heightened attention, using it to refine his strategies. He knew when to change locations, how to adjust his approach, and when to remain inconspicuous, turning public vigilance into a game of cat and mouse. Law enforcement learned from these encounters as well. Each escape and sighting provided valuable information about Bundy's methods, personality, and psychological tendencies. Investigators began developing more sophisticated profiles, focusing not just on physical appearance but on behavioral patterns, manipulative tendencies, and intelligence. These insights would eventually become critical in understanding his operations, anticipating his movements, and preparing for eventual capture. The nationwide manhunt also underscored the evolving relationship between criminal behavior and media exposure. Bundy's notoriety grew not only because of his crimes, but because of the public fascination with his escapes and elusiveness. His story became a chilling narrative of intellect and evil intertwined, highlighting how one man's cunning could exploit both human nature and systemic limitations. The media coverage amplified fear, informed public vigilance, and unintentionally shaped Bundy's own adaptive strategies. By the end of this period, it was clear that Bundy's escapes and the ensuing manhunt represented more than a confrontation between law enforcement and a fugitive. They were a demonstration of his capacity for observation, adaptation, and psychological manipulation on a national scale. The pursuit highlighted both the strengths and limitations of mid-1970s policing, while Bundy's actions underscored the terrifying efficiency of a mind capable of exploiting human trust, institutional gaps, and social expectations. The stage was now set for a relentless pursuit that would ultimately cross state lines, challenge the justice system, and leave an indelible mark on the history of criminal investigation in America. Chapter 11: The Trial Intensifies. Media frenzy and Bundy's defense. By the late 1970s, Ted Bundy had become a figure of national fascination, his escapes and the ongoing manhunt making headlines across America. When he was finally recaptured, the focus shifted from the manhunt to the courtroom, where law enforcement and Bundy himself would engage in a battle that was as psychological as it was legal. The trial represented more than a fight over evidence. It was a confrontation between a cunning predator and a justice system grappling with how to present and prosecute crimes of an unprecedented nature. Bundy's legal proceedings were marked by extraordinary public and media attention. Reporters crowded the courthouse, eager to capture every detail of the trial. Television cameras documented each appearance, turning proceedings into a spectacle that blurred the line between criminal justice and entertainment. Bundy, aware of the scrutiny, approached the courtroom with the same meticulous composure he had demonstrated during prior encounters with law enforcement. He dressed carefully, maintained polite demeanor, and engaged with lawyers, judges, and staff in a manner designed to project intelligence, credibility, and control. The media frenzy surrounding the trial created a double-edged sword for authorities. On one hand, widespread coverage helped disseminate information about the charges, witness testimonies, and public warnings. Communities were more vigilant, and tips poured in from concerned citizens. On the other hand, the attention also elevated Bundy's notoriety, reinforcing the public perception of him as a clever and almost theatrical criminal. He studied the media coverage closely, using it to refine his courtroom demeanor and manipulate public perception. In essence, Bundy treated the courtroom as another stage on which he could exercise control and influence. Bundy's defense strategy was as calculated as his crimes. He often appeared cooperative, providing statements that were carefully worded to avoid self-incrimination while casting doubt on the evidence presented by prosecutors. He leveraged procedural knowledge acquired in law school, challenging inconsistencies in witness testimonies and scrutinizing the handling of evidence. His approach highlighted the gap between traditional investigative methods and the sophisticated mind of a predator capable of anticipating legal strategy and manipulating perception simultaneously. Witnesses played a crucial role in the trial, yet their accounts were often complex and emotionally charged. Friends and acquaintances described Bundy as charming, polite, and ordinary, while victims' families recounted horror, fear, and tragedy. This juxtaposition created a profound tension in the courtroom. A man capable of inspiring trust, admiration, and sympathy in casual interactions, yet accused of heinous, calculated crimes. The challenge for the prosecution was to reconcile these two realities and present a coherent narrative that could withstand the scrutiny of jury deliberation. Bundy's manipulation extended to courtroom dynamics as well. He maintained eye contact, adjusted tone and expression strategically, and projected calm under intense questioning. His intelligence allowed him to anticipate lines of questioning and respond in ways that minimized perceived guilt. In effect, he turned the courtroom into an arena of psychological strategy, where perception could be as influential as hard evidence. Observers noted the surreal contrast. A man accused of multiple murders, yet conducting himself with poise, intellect, and almost hypnotic charm. The pressure on the jury was immense. They were tasked with assessing evidence, witness credibility, and Bundy's behavior while under the intense gaze of media and public opinion. Prosecutors had to balance the presentation of facts with the need to convey the calculated and predatory nature of Bundy's actions. Each day of testimony, cross-examination, and public spectacle reinforced the tension between the horrifying nature of the crimes and the outwardly ordinary persona of the accused. Bundy's ability to control his public image in court had strategic advantages beyond charm. By appearing credible, intelligent, and cooperative, he influenced perceptions of his character and reliability. This manipulation complicated the prosecution's task, forcing them to rely on meticulous documentation, careful cross-examination, and forensic evidence to establish a clear link between Bundy and the crimes. The courtroom thus became a contest not only of legal strategy but of psychological warfare, with Bundy exercising remarkable skill in the management of perception. During this period, the trial also highlighted systemic challenges faced by law enforcement. The complexity of Bundy's crimes, spanning multiple states, jurisdictions, and types of evidence, required unprecedented levels of coordination. Investigators were forced to compile vast amounts of documentation, witness accounts, and expert testimony, while navigating procedural limitations and the intense scrutiny of the media. Each step in the prosecution process revealed the gaps and limitations of the system, and Bundy's intelligence and charisma made exploiting these gaps all the more effective. The trial of Ted Bundy was thus not merely a legal proceeding. It was a study in human psychology, public perception, and the intersection of criminal ingenuity with institutional procedure. Every action, every statement, every calculated gesture revealed a predator who had honed the art of manipulation to a terrifying degree. For the public, it was both fascinating and horrifying to witness a man whose ordinary appearance and charm masked extraordinary danger and cruelty. The courtroom drama underscored the broader tension between intellect and morality, law and deception, visibility and concealment, a tension that would define Bundy's interactions with justice for the remainder of his life. As Ted Bundy's trial progressed, the media frenzy surrounding the proceedings reached unprecedented levels. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and radio stations chronicled every twist, turn, and courtroom exchange, turning the case into a national spectacle. For Bundy, this attention was both a challenge and an opportunity. While public scrutiny increased pressure on law enforcement and prosecutors, it also allowed Bundy to manipulate perception, reinforcing his carefully cultivated image as a charming, intelligent, and articulate young man. His awareness of the media's power became a strategic tool, extending his influence beyond the confines of the courtroom. Bundy's interactions with journalists were subtle but deliberate. He understood that his appearance, demeanor, and statements could be amplified to shape public opinion. He maintained a calm, confident presence during interviews and court appearances, presenting himself as rational, cooperative, and even sympathetic. The media, captivated by the paradox of a polite, educated man accused of heinous crimes, often portrayed him in ways that highlighted his charisma as much as his criminal allegations. This attention both intrigued the public and complicated the prosecution's efforts, as jurors were exposed to a complex mixture of fear, fascination, and admiration for Bundy's persona. Within the courtroom, Bundy's manipulative skills were equally pronounced. He engaged with attorneys, judges, and court staff in ways that seemed polite and cooperative, yet each action was carefully calibrated. He controlled tone, facial expression, and body language to project credibility and rationality. When questioned, he provided detailed, measured responses designed to appear transparent while avoiding self-incrimination. This mastery of courtroom psychology reinforced the perception of Bundy as composed and intelligent, even as he faced allegations of the most violent and premeditated crimes. The media's portrayal of Bundy as a charismatic figure introduced a paradoxical tension into the trial. On one hand, the public was horrified by the nature of the crimes. On the other, they were fascinated by the man who had evaded capture, manipulated social norms, and presented himself so convincingly in court. This duality amplified fear and intrigue simultaneously, turning Bundy into a symbol of both evil and uncanny intellect. Journalists covered every detail, from his meticulous clothing and mannerisms to his articulate answers, creating a narrative that was both unsettling and compelling. Bundy's legal strategy capitalized on these dynamics. He challenged the reliability of witness testimony, highlighted inconsistencies in evidence handling, and scrutinized procedural errors. Each legal maneuver was calculated to delay, confuse, or weaken the prosecution's case, buying time and exploiting both human and institutional vulnerabilities. His intelligence, combined with knowledge gained through law school, allowed him to navigate the courtroom with remarkable skill, reinforcing the notion that he was not only a criminal but a strategist capable of manipulating complex systems. The defense also leveraged psychological tactics, presenting Bundy as an ordinary, even respectable individual whose alleged actions were inconsistent with his public persona. This strategy sought to create doubt, emphasizing his polite, cooperative behavior, educational background, and social relationships. By contrasting Bundy's appearance and demeanor with the horrific allegations, the defense introduced a cognitive dissonance that complicated jurors' ability to reconcile evidence with perception. It was a calculated psychological play, exploiting the same principles Bundy had used in his abductions: charm, trust, and the manipulation of social expectations. The prosecution, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. They relied on meticulous documentation, witness testimony, and forensic evidence to build a cohesive narrative connecting Bundy to multiple murders and abductions. The challenge was not only the fragmented nature of the evidence but also Bundy's ability to control perception within the courtroom. Each piece of evidence had to be contextualized to demonstrate premeditation, pattern, and intent, all while contending with the public fascination that threatened to overshadow the gravity of the crimes. Bundy's manipulation extended even beyond the courtroom. He subtly influenced the tone of media coverage, the public's perception of his character, and even the attention given to specific aspects of the trial. By projecting intelligence and composure, he complicated the task of conveying his true threat to both the jury and the broader public. Each appearance reinforced the duality that had defined his life: a man who could charm, manipulate, and inspire trust while concealing a calculated capacity for violence and terror. The media circus surrounding Bundy's trial also had broader societal effects. Communities became increasingly alert to the dangers posed by strangers, young women adjusted routines for safety, and law enforcement agencies faced unprecedented pressure to solve cases and prevent further violence. Bundy's ability to exploit public attention highlighted a disturbing intersection between criminal psychology, media influence, and societal fear. His manipulations were not limited to individual victims. They extended to entire communities and institutions. By the conclusion of this phase, it was evident that Bundy's trial was as much a psychological contest as a legal proceeding. His charisma, intelligence, and manipulative skill created an environment in which perception and reality were in constant tension. Jurors, witnesses, journalists, and the public were forced to confront the dissonance between the outwardly ordinary man and the horrific nature of his crimes. The courtroom became a stage for Bundy's strategic genius, amplifying both fear and fascination, and setting the stage for subsequent legal battles, escapes, and the continued pursuit of justice that would define his infamy. Chapter 12. The escapes continue. Bundy's flight across states. Even after his high-profile trial had begun, Ted Bundy's audacity and cunning remained undiminished. The courtroom and jail, which were meant to contain him, instead became temporary obstacles that he meticulously studied, exploited, and ultimately overcame. Bundy's escapes during this period were not merely acts of desperation. They were the culmination of intelligence, careful observation, and a deeply ingrained understanding of human behavior and procedural weaknesses. Each escape intensified public fear and transformed the hunt for Bundy into one of the most complex and urgent manhunts in American history. Bundy's second escape in 1977 shocked both law enforcement and the public. While being held in a Colorado jail, he identified patterns in guard routines, schedules, and the architecture of the facility itself. He noted moments of inattention, areas of limited surveillance, and opportunities to manipulate personnel. Using a combination of charm and calculated deception, Bundy gained small privileges, gradually building an environment in which he could slip away unnoticed. It was a demonstration not of luck, but of a systematic approach to observation, manipulation, and action. Once free, Bundy moved quickly across state lines, understanding that mobility was both his shield and his strategy. He relied on the anonymity offered by unfamiliar communities, blending seamlessly with ordinary citizens. His outward appearance, intelligent, articulate, and seemingly unremarkable, allowed him to navigate public spaces without drawing suspicion. Bundy's familiarity with routine human behavior gave him an extraordinary advantage. He could predict how people would react, adjust his movements accordingly, and remain several steps ahead of pursuing authorities. Bundy's flight was not random. He carefully selected locations that provided both opportunity and concealment, often targeting areas where young women congregated. His understanding of geography, transportation routes, and local routines allowed him to plan abductions, avoid observation, and maintain a level of operational freedom despite being a fugitive. Each movement reflected the same meticulous planning he had applied to his earlier crimes: surveillance, patience, and the strategic exploitation of social and institutional weaknesses. Law enforcement faced immense challenges in tracking Bundy's movements. The fragmented communication systems of the 1970s, coupled with the lack of centralized databases, allowed him to exploit delays and gaps in information. Officers in one state might be unaware of sightings or tips from another jurisdiction for days, creating a window of opportunity for Bundy to travel and operate without immediate interference. The mobility of his crimes, combined with his intelligence, turned the manhunt into a multi-state endeavor fraught with complexity. Bundy's escapes also demonstrated a remarkable capacity for patience. He did not rush or act impulsively. Instead, he carefully evaluated each situation, waiting for the precise moment when an opportunity could be seized. Whether observing guard patterns, monitoring media coverage, or assessing community awareness, he applied the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined his abductions. Each successful escape reinforced his confidence, amplifying both audacity and operational sophistication. The psychological impact on the public was profound. Families became fearful, communities organized watch groups, and young women were cautioned to remain vigilant. The perception of Bundy as an almost untouchable predator, capable of exploiting human trust and institutional limitations, created a climate of anxiety and fascination. Media coverage amplified both the fear and intrigue, documenting each escape, sighting, and law enforcement pursuit, and transforming Bundy into a figure of national notoriety. Bundy's interactions with law enforcement during this period were subtle demonstrations of psychological manipulation. He remained calm, courteous, and cooperative when observed, projecting an image of rationality even while plotting his next move. Officers and officials, accustomed to conventional criminal behavior, often underestimated the depth of his cunning. Each escape exposed the limitations of procedural safeguards and highlighted the extraordinary intelligence and audacity of a criminal operating at the edge of visibility. Even as authorities intensified efforts, Bundy's strategic mobility allowed him to operate in multiple states with minimal risk of immediate capture. He blended routine travel with calculated evasion, frequently observing public reactions, police patterns, and media coverage to adjust his approach. The combination of mobility, observation, and psychological insight made him a formidable adversary, capable of exploiting the very systems designed to contain him. By the end of this phase, Bundy had transformed his escapes into both a practical and symbolic statement. He was a predator whose intelligence, planning, and manipulation made him exceptionally difficult to capture. His ability to evade law enforcement, operate across state lines, and exploit human behavior highlighted the terrifying reality of a criminal who could remain free despite intense pursuit. The escalating drama of Bundy's flight amplified public fear, challenged law enforcement capabilities, and reinforced the chilling duality that had defined his life. Outwardly ordinary, inwardly calculated and remorseless. Ted Bundy's flight across state lines highlighted not only his audacity but also the weaknesses of law enforcement systems in the 1970s. Each jurisdiction operated largely independently, with limited communication between departments, creating gaps that Bundy exploited to devastating effect. These jurisdictional gaps, combined with his intelligence, planning, and charm, allowed him to continue his predatory behavior while remaining elusive to the authorities who sought to contain him. Bundy understood that legal and geographic boundaries were tools he could manipulate. States had separate criminal databases, differing procedures for filing reports, and inconsistent methods for tracking suspects. Bundy's careful observation of these systems allowed him to move fluidly from one location to another, confident that law enforcement in one jurisdiction would not immediately coordinate with others. This strategic mobility transformed him from a local threat into a multi-state fugitive, complicating efforts to apprehend him and intensifying public fear. While on the run, Bundy's selection of locations for both concealment and criminal activity was deliberate. He targeted universities, public spaces, and areas frequented by young women, exploiting both opportunity and anonymity. His understanding of human behavior allowed him to gauge which areas would offer minimal scrutiny, which victims were most likely to respond to his charm, and how to navigate public spaces without arousing suspicion. This strategic approach reflected the same meticulous planning evident in his earlier crimes, demonstrating that his escapes were not random but extensions of a calculated operational system. Bundy's knowledge of human behavior extended beyond potential victims to law enforcement and community response. He understood that officials relied on patterns, assumptions, and routine procedures. By observing their behavior and anticipating responses, he could manipulate situations to his advantage. Whether exploiting lapses in attention, procedural inefficiencies, or social expectations, Bundy's actions revealed a predator capable of operating at the intersection of psychology, logistics, and criminal ingenuity. Media coverage became an unintentional extension of Bundy's strategy. Reports of his escapes, sightings, and elusiveness provided him with insights into public and law enforcement awareness. He carefully monitored these reports, adjusting his movements, appearance, and timing based on the information available. While authorities sought to warn communities and solicit tips, Bundy turned the same information into a tactical tool, using public vigilance as a measure of where and how to move undetected. The manhunt intensified as authorities mobilized resources across multiple states. Roadblocks, stakeouts, and coordinated patrols were deployed to intercept Bundy, yet his mobility and foresight consistently allowed him to avoid capture. His outward appearance as a polite, intelligent young man aided in blending seamlessly into public spaces, reducing the likelihood of recognition. The combination of observational skill, adaptability, and social manipulation made him extraordinarily difficult to apprehend. Bundy's escapes also had a profound psychological effect on law enforcement and the public. Communities became hyper-aware, adjusting daily routines to avoid potential encounters. Officers faced immense pressure, as each failed interception underscored both the predator's intelligence and the limitations of investigative methods. Public anxiety grew with each new report, intensifying the sense that Bundy was omnipresent, always a step ahead, and capable of exploiting both human and institutional vulnerabilities. Even during this period of flight, Bundy demonstrated remarkable patience. He did not act impulsively but assessed each situation carefully, waiting for the precise moment to move or strike. This patience allowed him to minimize risk, manipulate social interactions, and evade detection for extended periods. Each successful evasion reinforced his confidence, furthering his belief in his ability to control both environment and perception. Bundy's cross-state escapes also illustrated the evolving nature of investigative challenges. Authorities were forced to innovate, improve interjurisdictional communication, and develop new strategies to track a mobile, intelligent, and socially adept fugitive. The pursuit of Bundy became a testing ground for multi-state law enforcement coordination, demonstrating both the limitations and potential of investigative systems when confronted with a predator of exceptional cunning. By the end of this chapter, it was evident that Bundy's ability to exploit jurisdictional gaps, manipulate human perception, and navigate complex systems made him one of the most formidable criminals in modern history. His flight across states was not merely a testament to audacity, but a chilling demonstration of how intelligence, patience, and psychological insight could amplify both opportunity and danger. Each successful evasion intensified public fear, challenged law enforcement, and solidified Bundy's legacy as a predator whose methods were as terrifyingly calculated as they were horrifyingly effective. Chapter 13: The Final Arrest. Cornering the elusive killer. After years of eluding authorities, Ted Bundy's audacity and meticulous planning were finally approaching a moment of reckoning. His ability to manipulate, charm, and evade had made him one of the most infamous fugitives in American history. Yet, despite intelligence, mobility, and psychological cunning, the forces of law enforcement, combined with heightened public awareness and procedural evolution, were steadily closing in. Bundy's final arrest marked not only the culmination of a multi-state pursuit, but also a pivotal moment that would confirm the terrifying scope of his crimes. By 1978, Bundy had established patterns of movement that were both predictable and cunningly deceptive. Investigators had learned to anticipate certain behaviors, the timing of his travel, the types of communities he targeted, and even the manner in which he would approach victims. Public tips and sightings provided increasingly reliable leads, narrowing the circle in which he could operate without detection. While Bundy remained a master manipulator, the environment had shifted. Each state's police force had become more vigilant, more coordinated, and more determined to prevent further tragedies. The critical breakthrough came in Florida, where a combination of proactive law enforcement strategy and Bundy's own overconfidence intersected. He had been living and traveling under aliases, blending into society with his characteristic charm and ordinary appearance. Yet, his boldness, hallmark of his criminal career, ultimately became a vulnerability. Law enforcement officers, aware of his mobility and prior escapes, intensified traffic stops, identity verification, and surveillance in high-risk areas. These measures, designed to exploit even minor errors, created the conditions necessary to finally corner him. Bundy's arrest in 1978 was sudden yet methodical from law enforcement's perspective. Officers stopped him for a routine traffic violation, a situation that could have been inconsequential for an ordinary citizen but was momentous in this context. Bundy, ever composed, initially presented his alias and identification with confidence. However, the police, trained in cross-referencing information from multiple jurisdictions, quickly identified discrepancies that triggered deeper scrutiny. Within hours, the man considered untouchable was placed under custody, his mobility and manipulative freedom abruptly curtailed. From Bundy's perspective, the arrest was another scenario to navigate. True to form, he maintained calm, charm, and politeness, projecting the image of an ordinary driver stopped for a minor infraction. Observing reactions, adjusting demeanor, and controlling his interactions, he exhibited the same psychological skill that had allowed him to elude capture for years. Yet, unlike previous encounters, this arrest occurred in an environment where law enforcement coordination, media attention, and public vigilance had reached unprecedented levels, limiting the space for improvisation. The arrest itself quickly became headline news. Media outlets across the nation reported the capture, emphasizing both Bundy's infamy and the dramatic circumstances of his apprehension. The juxtaposition was stark. The charming, articulate young man seen in courtrooms and public spaces now formally recognized as one of the most dangerous and elusive killers in history. The public reaction ranged from relief to fascination, as citizens grasped the reality that a predator who had terrorized multiple states was finally behind bars. Following the arrest, law enforcement immediately undertook a systematic effort to secure evidence, establish jurisdiction, and prevent further escape. Bundy was placed in highly controlled environments, and every movement, interaction, and potential vulnerability was scrutinized. Officers, informed by prior failures and Bundy's notorious history of evasion, implemented precautions designed to mitigate his intelligence, manipulative ability, and capacity for exploitation. The period following the arrest highlighted both the evolution of law enforcement procedures and the extreme care required to contain a criminal of Bundy's caliber. Bundy's reaction to being cornered was consistent with his established behavioral patterns. He remained outwardly calm, cooperative when strategically beneficial, and constantly observant of his environment. Interviews and preliminary interrogations became exercises in psychological warfare, with Bundy subtly probing law enforcement reactions, assessing weaknesses, and maintaining an appearance of reasonableness. Even in custody, he leveraged social and psychological skills, emphasizing the tension between outward charm and hidden menace that had characterized his criminal career. The arrest also had profound implications for the communities he had terrorized. Families of victims, law enforcement personnel, and citizens across multiple states experienced a mix of relief and renewed awareness of the danger Bundy had represented. The capture underscored both the importance of public vigilance and the limitations of investigative methods in confronting a predator who relied on intelligence, patience, and manipulation. Communities, while relieved, were reminded of the extraordinary threat posed by an individual who could exploit social norms, procedural gaps, and human empathy with devastating effect. By the end of this phase, it was clear that Bundy's final arrest marked a turning point. It signaled the end of his multi-state mobility, the containment of a uniquely dangerous mind, and the beginning of a period in which justice and investigation would reveal the full scope of his crimes. Yet even in this moment of capture, the duality that defined Ted Bundy, charming, articulate, and outwardly ordinary, yet calculating, manipulative, and violent, remained evident, leaving an indelible mark on law enforcement, public perception, and the historical understanding of one of America's most infamous serial killers. Once Ted Bundy was securely in custody, the focus shifted from containment to understanding the breadth and depth of his crimes. The arrest had ended his ability to move freely, but it marked the beginning of a far more intense phase of law enforcement activity. Interrogations, evidence collection, and piecing together the scope of a predatory life that spanned multiple states and years. Bundy's capture offered investigators the rare opportunity to study a serial killer with extraordinary intelligence, manipulative skill, and a chilling capacity for violence. Bundy's interrogations were meticulous and psychologically intense. Investigators approached each session cautiously, aware that he could manipulate perception, deflect suspicion, and exploit procedural weaknesses. Bundy, ever observant, maintained his composure, answered questions selectively, and engaged in subtle psychological tactics. His calm demeanor, articulate responses, and occasional displays of charm created a dissonance that challenged investigators' ability to fully gauge his culpability. Each interaction was a reminder that they were dealing not just with a criminal, but with a calculated manipulator whose intelligence rivaled that of those pursuing him. The unraveling of Bundy's crimes required painstaking cross-referencing of missing persons reports, witness testimonies, and physical evidence across multiple states. Investigators worked tirelessly to establish patterns, timelines, and connections. Each piece of evidence was scrutinized in the context of prior disappearances, abductions, and forensic findings. Bundy's mobility and strategic planning had previously made such connections difficult to prove, but his capture enabled a more comprehensive examination of the geographic and temporal scope of his predatory behavior. Bundy's cooperation, when it occurred, was strategic. He provided information selectively, sometimes offering details that were verifiable and seemingly insightful, while withholding key elements that could directly implicate him in specific crimes. This selective engagement created a psychological push and pull for investigators, requiring patience, persistence, and a careful balance between interrogation and evidence collection. Bundy's intelligence and manipulative skill turned each session into a contest of wits, as law enforcement sought to extract truths without allowing themselves to be deceived by his charisma. The physical and forensic evidence collected after Bundy's arrest provided critical insights into his methods and the scale of his crimes. Items recovered from vehicles, residences, and personal belongings corroborated witness accounts and helped establish timelines of abduction and murder. Bundy's meticulous organization of personal effects and careful disposal of certain evidence illustrated his strategic mind, as well as his chilling capacity for forethought in committing violent acts. For investigators, the evidence was both a revelation and a confirmation of suspicions that had grown over years of pursuit. Media coverage intensified again during this period, documenting the unraveling of Bundy's crimes and the psychological complexity of his interactions with law enforcement. Public fascination remained high, blending horror with curiosity as the scale of his predation became evident. Bundy's ability to charm, manipulate, and present himself as rational continued to complicate perceptions, even as the evidence against him mounted. The narrative of an intelligent, articulate, and outwardly ordinary man committing acts of extraordinary violence captivated both investigators and the general public alike. Investigators also focused on understanding Bundy's psychological profile. Behavioral experts studied his manipulation tactics, his charm, and his ability to blend seamlessly into ordinary society. These sessions provided insights into the mind of a predator who had repeatedly exploited social norms, procedural gaps, and human empathy. Bundy's combination of intelligence, charisma, and lack of remorse offered a rare opportunity to examine the intersection of psychological traits and criminal methodology, deepening both the public and professional understanding of serial predation. During this period, law enforcement also worked to prevent further attempts at escape. Enhanced security measures, observation protocols, and procedural safeguards were implemented, reflecting the lessons learned from Bundy's prior evasion. These measures were informed by both the tactical intelligence he had displayed and the knowledge gained from his manipulative behavior. For authorities, containing Bundy became as much a psychological challenge as a physical one, requiring constant vigilance and strategic planning. By the conclusion of these investigations, the enormity of Bundy's crimes was fully apparent. Multiple states were involved, each with cases that could now be definitively linked to him. The psychological, geographic, and logistical complexity of his criminal career became clear, illustrating a predator capable of exploiting mobility, charm, intelligence, and social expectations with devastating effect. For law enforcement, the process reinforced the need for coordination, behavioral profiling, and meticulous evidence collection when confronting criminals of extraordinary cunning. Bundy's final arrest and the subsequent unraveling of his crimes stand as a testament to both his predatory genius and the relentless determination of law enforcement. While the nation had finally secured the elusive killer, the full scope of his actions revealed a chilling portrait of intelligence used to manipulate, charm, and kill. Bundy's capture marked the end of his freedom, but also the beginning of a comprehensive understanding of a criminal mind whose cunning, patience, and manipulation would remain studied, analyzed, and feared for decades to come. Chapter 14: The Final Trial. Bundy versus Justice. With Ted Bundy securely in custody, the nation turned its attention to the legal proceedings that would determine his fate. This final trial represented more than a court case. It was the culmination of years of investigation, manhunts, and the painstaking collection of evidence across multiple states. For the public, it was the ultimate confrontation with a man who had become a symbol of terror, intelligence, and manipulation. A predator whose crimes had left indelible scars on countless families. Bundy's courtroom presence continued to captivate observers. He maintained his polished appearance, calm demeanor, and articulate speech, presenting himself as composed and credible. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a man fully aware of the gravity of the proceedings and the strategies he would need to deploy to protect himself legally. Each interaction with judges, attorneys, and court staff was measured, deliberate, and designed to influence perception while minimizing direct vulnerability. Bundy's mastery of social psychology was once again on display, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he could manipulate appearances to his advantage. The prosecution faced immense challenges. Bundy's crimes had spanned several states, and linking him conclusively to each act of violence required careful coordination, meticulous documentation, and corroboration of multiple sources of evidence. Witnesses were called from far-flung jurisdictions, forensic analyses were presented to establish timelines, and investigators detailed patterns of predation that illustrated the methodical and premeditated nature of Bundy's behavior. Each piece of evidence contributed to a mosaic that ultimately sought to portray the stark contrast between Bundy's outward charm and his inner capacity for violence. Bundy's defense, meanwhile, continued to employ psychological and procedural strategies. He scrutinized witness credibility, highlighted perceived inconsistencies in law enforcement procedures, and questioned the integrity of evidence collection. His legal knowledge, honed during his time in law school, enabled him to challenge the prosecution's narrative at a procedural level, emphasizing technicalities and legal nuances that could create doubt. The courtroom thus became a battleground not only over facts but over interpretation, perception, and the authority of institutional systems. Media attention intensified during the trial, capturing every moment of testimony, cross-examination, and legal maneuver. Television, newspapers, and radio provided continuous coverage, framing Bundy's dual persona as both chilling and fascinating. The public, drawn to the narrative of intellect and evil intertwined, followed the proceedings with rapt attention. Bundy himself was acutely aware of the media spotlight, using it to observe public reactions, refine his courtroom strategies, and manipulate the perception of those who would ultimately pass judgment. One of the most compelling aspects of the trial was the juxtaposition between Bundy's demeanor and the horrific nature of the crimes he was accused of committing. Witnesses recounted instances of abduction, violence, and terror, painting a portrait of a calculated and remorseless predator. Yet Bundy, sitting calmly in the courtroom, exuded a sense of normalcy and composure that confounded observers. This contrast created a psychological tension that became a defining feature of the trial, forcing jurors, the public, and even legal professionals to reconcile the dissonance between perception and reality. Expert testimony played a pivotal role. Behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, and psychologists provided insights into Bundy's motivations, patterns, and methods. These experts described the meticulous planning involved in his crimes, the exploitation of social norms, and the psychological manipulation used to select, approach, and control victims. By presenting Bundy's actions through a scientific lens, the prosecution sought to move beyond emotional reactions and establish a rational, evidence-based understanding of his predatory behavior. Bundy's courtroom strategies were relentless. He engaged in calculated charm, monitored reactions, and subtly influenced proceedings whenever possible. His calm responses, measured gestures, and articulate speech created a tension in which his intelligence and manipulative skill were apparent, even as the evidence of his guilt grew overwhelming. Every word, glance, and movement was potentially strategic, reinforcing the duality that had defined his public and criminal persona throughout his life. The trial also underscored the evolving capabilities of law enforcement and the justice system in handling serial predation. Multi-state coordination, forensic innovation, and behavioral profiling were instrumental in presenting a coherent narrative linking Bundy to multiple crimes. The proceedings demonstrated the interplay between institutional strategy, legal procedure, and human psychology, a dynamic battlefield in which Bundy's intelligence was matched by the collective effort of investigators, attorneys, and forensic experts. By the conclusion of this first part of the trial, it was evident that Bundy's final legal battle was more than a fight for personal freedom. It was a confrontation between intellect and justice, perception and reality, manipulation and evidence. The courtroom had become both a stage and a proving ground, illustrating the terrifying capacity of a mind capable of blending charm, intelligence, and brutality. For the public, the trial reinforced the chilling reality of Bundy's dual nature and set the stage for the dramatic conclusion that would determine whether the elusive killer would finally be held accountable for his crimes. As Ted Bundy's trial progressed toward its conclusion, the focus shifted from the intricate legal maneuvering to the overwhelming weight of evidence and the gravity of his actions. The courtroom became a crucible in which intellect, strategy, and justice collided. Bundy, ever meticulous in his presentation, maintained his composed exterior, but the prosecutorial machinery, combined with meticulous evidence collection, increasingly constrained his ability to manipulate perception. For the public, the trial had become the ultimate confrontation between a calculating predator and the full force of the law. The prosecution's strategy was relentless. Each piece of evidence, from physical artifacts to forensic analyses, was carefully tied to a timeline that illustrated Bundy's methodical approach to abduction and murder. Witness testimonies were corroborated across multiple jurisdictions, demonstrating patterns of predation that left little room for doubt. The geographic dispersion of his crimes, once an obstacle, became a compelling narrative, showing a calculated mobility that highlighted the extraordinary planning and forethought involved in his criminal activity. Bundy's courtroom behavior continued to captivate observers. He remained articulate, attentive, and outwardly rational, but the strategy that had previously allowed him to manipulate perception was increasingly ineffective against the weight of accumulated evidence. While his composure suggested intelligence and confidence, it could not counter the detailed documentation of his actions, eyewitness accounts, or forensic links that bound him to his crimes. The tension between Bundy's charm and the undeniable reality of his deeds created a psychological landscape in which jurors, media, and the public grappled with the terrifying duality of his persona. Expert testimony reached a dramatic intensity during the final stages of the trial. Psychologists and behavioral analysts described Bundy's pattern of manipulation, premeditation, and predation, illustrating how charm, social intelligence, and deception had been employed systematically to select and control victims. These analyses provided not only a scientific framework for understanding his actions, but also a moral and ethical lens through which the jury could assess the depth of his culpability. The evidence portrayed Bundy not as a single, impulsive criminal, but as a deliberate, calculating predator whose intelligence had been weaponized for destruction. As the trial approached its conclusion, Bundy's defense efforts were increasingly overshadowed by the weight of overwhelming evidence. Procedural arguments, challenges to witness credibility, and legal technicalities could not counter the confluence of physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and behavioral analysis. The meticulous preparation by prosecutors, combined with the cross-jurisdictional coordination that had evolved over years of investigation, left Bundy with few avenues for effective resistance. The courtroom became a stage on which the intellectual battle he had once controlled now tilted decisively against him. The sentencing phase brought the culmination of this legal and psychological confrontation. The jury, informed by comprehensive evidence, expert testimony, and the detailed recounting of Bundy's crimes, faced the difficult task of delivering justice in a case of extraordinary complexity. The deliberations highlighted not only the moral imperative of accountability, but also the challenge of reconciling Bundy's outwardly ordinary persona with the horrific nature of his actions. For families of victims, law enforcement, and society at large, the verdict represented both closure and the recognition of the depth of his predation. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom's tension gave way to a collective acknowledgement of justice achieved. Bundy was convicted on multiple counts of murder, and the sentences reflected the severity and premeditation of his crimes. The judgment marked the end of his freedom, the containment of a mind capable of extraordinary manipulation, and the beginning of a period in which society could finally comprehend the full scope of his actions. For investigators, the trial validated years of meticulous work, collaboration, and persistence, demonstrating the capacity of coordinated legal and forensic strategy to hold even the most cunning criminal accountable. The trial's conclusion also reinforced critical lessons about the interplay between criminal psychology, procedural safeguards, and public perception. Bundy's case demonstrated that intelligence, charm, and social manipulation could be used to exploit vulnerabilities in law enforcement and society, but that persistence, coordination, and rigorous analysis could ultimately overcome even the most sophisticated predator. The courtroom had served as both a proving ground and a theater of human behavior, illuminating the terrifying efficacy of Bundy's criminal mind and the resolute capacity of justice to respond. For the public, the final trial crystallized the duality that had defined Bundy throughout his criminal career. He remained outwardly composed, articulate, and intelligent, yet the evidence revealed a capacity for calculated violence and manipulation that had left an indelible mark on multiple communities. The legal process not only held Bundy accountable, but also provided a framework for understanding the complex psychology of a serial predator, offering insights that would inform both law enforcement practices and public awareness for decades to come. By the end of this chapter, the story of Bundy's final trial stood as a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice, the importance of evidence-based prosecution, and the chilling reality of a mind capable of blending intelligence, charm, and extreme violence. The courtroom had witnessed the convergence of cunning and accountability, leaving a permanent imprint on legal history, criminal psychology, and societal understanding of one of America's most infamous serial killers. Chapter 15: The Final Days and Legacy of Ted Bundy. Following his conviction and sentencing, Ted Bundy entered the final phase of his life, a period marked by confinement, reflection, legal appeals, and intense public scrutiny. The man who had once manipulated courts, law enforcement, and public perception was now under constant observation, his freedom irrevocably removed. Yet even in these final days, Bundy continued to demonstrate a calculated intelligence and psychological acuity that had defined both his criminal career and his infamy. Bundy's incarceration involved stringent security measures designed to prevent further escape attempts. Having previously exploited procedural weaknesses and human oversight, authorities implemented constant supervision, strict routines, and controlled interactions. Every aspect of his confinement was carefully monitored to eliminate opportunities for manipulation. For Bundy, the loss of mobility and autonomy represented a stark contrast to the freedom he had enjoyed during his criminal exploits, yet he continued to exert influence through his words, interviews, and correspondence, maintaining a subtle psychological presence even behind bars. During this period, Bundy engaged in legal appeals aimed at challenging aspects of his conviction, though these efforts were largely unsuccessful. Each appeal highlighted procedural nuances and legal technicalities, reflecting Bundy's understanding of law, evidence, and courtroom strategy. These appeals were also accompanied by media attention, as journalists reported on developments, legal arguments, and Bundy's demeanor. While largely unsuccessful in overturning his sentences, the appeals process demonstrated the persistence, intelligence, and tactical thinking that had characterized Bundy's life. Bundy also gave interviews during his final years, which were carefully crafted to serve multiple purposes. In some cases, he sought to rationalize his actions, offering insights into his psychology and methods. In others, he maintained an outward charm, projecting an image of calm and control that had defined him in courtrooms and social interactions. These interviews were scrutinized by psychologists, journalists, and the public, providing a chilling window into the mind of a predator who had once relied on charisma and deception to evade justice. Each statement, whether revealing or evasive, contributed to the enduring fascination with his life and crimes. The psychological impact of Bundy's final days extended beyond the prison walls. For the families of victims, each interview and appearance served as a reminder of the trauma he had caused. For law enforcement and criminologists, these interactions offered rare opportunities to study a serial predator directly, deepening the understanding of patterns, motivations, and behavioral traits. Public fascination remained high, as society grappled with the paradox of a man simultaneously human in demeanor yet capable of extraordinary violence. Bundy's conduct in prison also reflected his enduring need for control. He carefully managed interactions with staff, other inmates, and visitors, exerting influence through conversation, observation, and psychological presence. Even in confinement, he leveraged the tools available to him, language, persuasion, and social intelligence, to shape perceptions and maintain a sense of dominance within a highly controlled environment. This capacity for manipulation, even when physical freedom was curtailed, underscored the central duality of his character: outwardly composed and charming, yet inwardly calculating and remorseless. The approach of his execution intensified public and institutional focus. Bundy's case had already become emblematic of the challenges posed by intelligent and manipulative serial offenders, influencing legal precedent, investigative techniques, and public awareness. The final days before his execution were carefully documented, analyzed, and reported, illustrating both the procedural rigor required to carry out justice and the psychological intensity surrounding a man whose crimes had captivated and horrified. The nation's execution day approached. Bundy's interactions and statements continued to reflect a blend of composure, reflection, and strategic self-presentation. While he had no ability to manipulate the legal system at this point, his intelligence and psychological acuity allowed him to shape narratives, leaving a lasting impression on those who observed him. Prison staff, journalists, and psychologists noted the persistent duality. A man fully aware of his fate, yet still capable of subtle manipulation and articulate reasoning. Bundy's final days also provided insight into the societal and cultural impact of his life and crimes. His story had influenced media portrayals of serial killers, forensic psychology, and public understanding of predatory behavior. From his ability to evade capture to the manipulation of perception in courtrooms, every phase of his life had contributed to a broader understanding of criminal psychology and law enforcement challenges. His legacy, while horrifying, offered lessons in detection, prevention, and the psychological complexity of violent offenders. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that Bundy's final days were a period of both containment and reflection, closure and analysis. His life, crimes, and the pursuit of justice that defined it left a permanent imprint on society, law enforcement, and the understanding of criminal behavior. While his actions had caused incalculable pain, the meticulous documentation, study, and reporting of his final years ensured that his story would remain a cautionary tale, a subject of analysis, and a testament to the complex interplay of intelligence, manipulation, and morality. The final chapter of Ted Bundy's life was marked by anticipation, reflection, and the culmination of a story that had captivated, horrified, and fascinated the public for nearly a decade. As execution day approached, the man who had once eluded authorities, manipulated courtrooms, and terrorized communities was confronted with the absolute finality of justice. The nation watched closely, media coverage documenting every procedural step, every psychological nuance, and every public reaction. Bundy's demeanor in the days leading up to his execution was characteristically composed, a chilling testament to the intelligence and psychological skill that had defined his life. He engaged in interviews selectively, reflecting on his life, crimes, and the circumstances that had brought him to this point. While some of his statements offered insight into his methods and motivations, others were carefully constructed to maintain a sense of control over perception. Even when facing the ultimate consequence, Bundy's mind operated with the precision, observation, and manipulation that had been central to his criminal career. Execution procedures were meticulously planned to prevent error or disruption, reflecting lessons learned from his previous escapes and manipulative behavior. Security was heightened, routines were strictly enforced, and every movement was observed. Bundy's history had taught authorities that even a minor lapse could have significant consequences, and the culmination of his life required procedures as thorough as the crimes he had committed were horrific. The intersection of procedure, psychology, and accountability became evident, as Bundy's final hours were shaped by the very systems he had once sought to evade. For the public and families of victims, Bundy's execution was both closure and a stark reminder of the trauma he had caused. Communities affected by his crimes experienced relief, tempered by the lingering memory of lives lost and lives forever altered. Psychologists, criminologists, and legal scholars also observed Bundy's final moments as an opportunity to understand the enduring dynamics of manipulation, intelligence, and predation. The case had already reshaped approaches to serial crime investigation, media reporting, and psychological profiling, and the execution reinforced the practical necessity of these frameworks. Bundy's legacy, however, extended far beyond his death. His life and crimes became a focal point for discussions on criminal psychology, law enforcement strategies, and societal vulnerability. Books, documentaries, and studies emerged analyzing his methods, intelligence, and manipulative skills. Behavioral profiling techniques, now standard in investigating serial offenses, were informed in part by the meticulous documentation of his actions. Bundy's story illustrated how charm, intelligence, and calculated behavior could be weaponized to devastating effect, highlighting the importance of vigilance, forensic innovation, and interagency coordination in criminal justice. Even in death, Bundy's duality continued to provoke fascination. He remained a man outwardly capable of charm, intellect, and rationality, yet inwardly driven by compulsions, cruelty, and a capacity for violence that seemed almost incomprehensible. This duality, the coexistence of normalcy and predation, became central to the enduring study of his life, shaping how society, law enforcement, and psychologists conceptualized the complex interplay of personality, intelligence, and criminal behavior. His story served as both a cautionary tale and a framework for understanding extreme criminal psychology. Bundy's execution marked a clear end to his physical threat, but did not diminish the cultural, legal, and psychological significance of his life. The meticulous study of his crimes and methods became a template for understanding serial predation, including the ways in which offenders exploit social norms, institutional weaknesses, and human psychology. Law enforcement agencies integrated lessons from his case into training programs, investigative protocols, and procedural safeguards, aiming to prevent future predators from exploiting similar gaps. Bundy's influence on criminal profiling and forensic psychology remains profound, reflecting the enduring relevance of his life's dark narrative. The societal fascination with Bundy also underscored deeper questions about morality, evil, and human behavior. Why was he capable of such charm and brutality simultaneously? How could intelligence and social skill coexist with cruelty and remorselessness? These questions, while unanswerable in a simple sense, became central to both academic study and public reflection. Bundy's life exemplified the unsettling capacity for human duality, the ability to inspire trust and admiration while concealing calculated malevolence. By the time of his execution, Bundy had left an indelible mark on history, law enforcement, psychology, and culture. His capture, trial, and ultimate demise demonstrated the relentless pursuit of justice, the evolution of investigative techniques, and the complexity of human behavior. The story of Ted Bundy remains both a warning and a subject of fascination, illustrating the terrifying efficiency of a mind that could manipulate, charm, and kill while challenging societal and institutional assumptions. In the final reckoning, Bundy's death brought closure to his personal story, but it also cemented his enduring legacy as a figure whose life, crimes, and methods continue to influence society. From the terror he inflicted to the lessons derived from his capture and prosecution, Bundy's narrative persists as a cautionary chronicle of intelligence used for destruction and the capacity of justice to ultimately prevail against even the most cunning of predators. His life, crimes, and death remain studied, analyzed, and remembered. A complex portrait of darkness and intellect, horror and fascination that continues to captivate and inform the world.